Hello and welcome to the disturbing world of medieval folklore, a soft-spoken journey through the unsettling tales and beliefs of the Middle Ages. If you're just settling in for a relaxing listen before bed, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, historical storytelling, be sure to subscribe for more soothing explorations of the past. As you get cozy and let my words wash over you, let's gently step into the peculiar realm of medieval folklore. In our modern world of science and reason, it's easy to dismiss the superstitions of ages past as merely quaint relics or primitive fancies. But for the people of the Middle Ages, the creatures and characters that populated their folklore were vividly real and often terrifying. These tales offer a fascinating window into the medieval psyche, reflecting the deep-seated fears, beliefs, and anxieties of the time. In a world plagued by war, disease, and religious upheaval, folklore served as a way to make sense of the chaos, to give form to the unknown, even if that form was monstrous. Through hushed whispers around the hearth and ominous stories scrawled on crumbling parchment, medieval Europeans conjured all manner of disturbing entities. Dragons and demons, witches and werewolves, restless revenants and malevolent fairies. In the flickering shadows of candlelight, these beings took on a terrifying reality. But beneath the surface, they also embodied very human dreads and desires. The fear of evil, the yearning for meaning in an uncertain world, even social commentary, cloaked in supernatural trappings. By exploring the dark dreamscape of medieval folklore, we can better understand the hopes, doubts, and secret shadowy corners of the medieval mind. So in this tranquil series, we'll encounter some of the most intriguing figures, both human and otherworldly, that shaped the folklore of the Middle Ages. Through their stories, we'll untangle the rich and revealing web of medieval superstition. All in the same soothing tones, of course, to help you unwind and drift off. As we embark on this journey into the haunted past, let's first set the stage by examining the origins of medieval folklore itself. Like a patchwork quilt of history and myth, it drew on strands stretching back to antiquity. Long before the Middle Ages, pagan beliefs and superstitions held sway across Europe. Tales of capricious gods, nature spirits, and fearsome monsters were deeply woven into the fabric of pre-Christian cultures. The Vikings regaled each other with sagas of trolls and giants. Germanic tribes spun dark yarns of shape-shifting beasts. Celtic legends teemed with fairies both fair and foul. As Christianity spread its dominion, it didn't wholly erase these earlier traditions. Rather, many pagan motifs were absorbed and adapted, often given a new theological spin. The old gods became saints or demons. Magical creatures morphed into agents of divine intervention or diabolical temptation. Miracles and marvels found their way into Christian hagiographies and chronicles. Yet this process of assimilation was far from uniform. Across the patchwork of medieval kingdoms and principalities, folklore took on distinctive regional flavors. In the misty isles of Britain and Ireland, Celtic myths of fae folk persisted with particular potency. The dark forests of Central and Eastern Europe birthed their own unique tales of vampires and witches. Scandinavia's long winters nurtured bone-chilling sagas of Draugr and frost giants. Even as the Church sought to impose a common Christian culture, this kaleidoscope of regional lore lent medieval folklore its rich and varied hues. A strange tapestry of the universal and the local, the old and the new, the sacred and the profane. It was against this backdrop that the most iconic creatures of medieval folklore took shape, and few loomed as large in the medieval imagination as dragons. Hulking, serpentine, and wreathed in flames, these scaly behemoths were the ultimate embodiment of primal terror. In countless tales, they descended upon villages and monasteries, ravaging flocks and devouring maidens. Only the bravest knights could hope to vanquish these infernal foes, often with the aid of divine intervention. The Ramsund carving in Sweden, etched sometime in the 11th century, vividly depicts a classic dragon-slaying scene from Norse mythology. It shows Sigurd, the legendary hero, plunging his blade into the belly of the fell dragon Fafnir, a potent symbol of good triumphing over bestial evil. Yet dragons weren't just fearsome adversaries in medieval lore. They were also seen as powerful elemental forces, guarding vast hoards of treasure and ancient wisdom. To confront a dragon was to confront the wild, untamable aspects of nature and the self. In slaying the beast without, the hero also tamed the beast within. This duality found its ultimate expression in the legend of St. George and the dragon. According to the famous Golden Legend, George, a Roman soldier-turned-Christian martyr, rescued a Libyan city from a plague-bringing dragon. By vanquishing the monster and converting the grateful populace, he embodied the victory of faith over the forces of evil, both external and internal. George's tale spread far and wide in the Middle Ages, cementing his status as the patron saint of England and many other nations. Symbolically slaying the dragon became a common motif in religious art and architecture, a stirring reminder of Christianity's conquest over the old ways. But dragons were far from the only monsters to haunt the medieval psyche. Lurking in the uncharted corners of medieval maps, beyond the edges of the known world, all manner of dread beasts were said to dwell, and few were more feared than the leviathans of the deep. For medieval sailors, the open ocean was a realm of primal peril. Unforgiving tempests, uncharted shoals, and the ever-present threat of pirates were hazard enough. But in the swirling mists and inky depths, even more fearsome foes were believed to lurk. Gargantuan sea serpents, ship-swallowing whales, and all manner of scaly, tentacled terrors. The most famous of these aquatic nightmares was the kraken, a monstrous cephalopod said to drag whole ships and crews to their doom. Described as a sea monk or sea bishop for its eerily humanoid head, this unholy hybrid embodied the medieval dread of the ocean as a chaotic alien realm. A watery hell teeming with gods' discarded mistakes. Other tales spoke of the Hafgufa, a titanic sea monster capable of disguising itself as an island. Unwitting sailors would moor upon its back, only to be drowned when the creature plunged into the abyss. The line between animal and landscape blurred in these unnerving accounts, the familiar rendered strange and threatening. Even as medieval navigation advanced, unlocking new trade routes and distant lands, the primal power of sea monster legends endured. They gave voice to the perils of the unknown and the smallness of man against the vastness of God's creation. To venture beyond the sight of shore was to enter a liminal space, a world inverted, where the usual rules didn't apply, where monsters ruled the waves. Indeed, this notion of a world turned upside down was a common thread in medieval folklore. A disturbing, dreamlike logic where the lines between life and death, human and beast, natural and supernatural were blurred. And no figure embodied this unsettling liminality more than the revenant. In medieval lore, revenants were the unquiet dead, corpses reanimated through demonic possession or sheer force of will. Unlike the ghostly apparitions of later folklore, these undead beings were thought to physically rise from the grave, their bodies hideously bloated and incorruptible. The 12th century English historian William of Newburgh chronicled several chilling accounts of revenants stalking the living. In one tale, a formerly pious villager returns from the dead as a monstrous ghoul, his midnight rampages spreading pestilence and terror. Only when the townsfolk exhume the corpse and burn the heart is the nightmare ended. Such stories reflect the deep medieval anxiety surrounding death and the afterlife. In an age of recurrent plagues and low life expectancy, the ever-present spectre of mortality loomed large. Church doctrine held that the soul faced immediate judgment upon death, with eternal bliss or damnation hanging in the balance. But folklore often subverted this tidy eschatology. Tales of revenants suggested that the border between life and death was disturbingly porous. That damnation might not be as final as the priests proclaimed, that the corrupting taint of sin could animate the flesh beyond the grave. This morbid preoccupation with death gone awry even found its way into medieval jurisprudence. In some parts of Europe, suspected revenants were put on posthumous trial, their guilt determined by ordeal. A guilty verdict could result in staking, decapitation, or cremation of the offending corpse. As with many aspects of medieval folklore, there was a strong moralizing undercurrent to revenant tales. Those who returned as undead monsters were inevitably sinners in life, the greedy, the gluttonous, the ungodly. In death, their wickedness was literally made flesh, a grotesque object lesson in the wages of iniquity. Yet even as the church sought to co-opt these unsettling folk tales for didactic purposes, their power to disturb and unsettle endured. They tapped into primal human fears of death, decay, and the uncanny, fears that even the promise of heavenly salvation couldn't wholly allay. These eerie echoes of pagan myth and superstition found their way into the works of many medieval chroniclers and thinkers. But few embraced the bizarre quite so readily as Gervase of Tilbury. Born around 1150 in the English village of Tilbury, Gervase was a well-travelled cleric and scholar who served in the courts of several European monarchs. But he is best remembered today for his Otia Imperialia, or Recreation for an Emperor, a sprawling compendium of marvels, miracles, and outright oddities. Written around 1215 and dedicated to Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, the Otia is a wild ride through the medieval imagination. Across 3 volumes, Gervase serves up a dizzying array of fantastical tales and pseudo-scientific speculations, all delivered with a straight-faced credulity that's both charming and unsettling. In one memorable passage, Gervase recounts the story of a mysterious race of small, swarthy men who emerge from the earth each summer to trade with the locals of Herefordshire. These secret people, as he calls them, vanish back underground come winter, leaving only faint whispers of their presence. Elsewhere, he tells of a monstrous hybrid creature, half man, half lion, captured in the forests of England and presented as a gift to King Henry II. The beast, Gervase assures us, was gentle as a lamb and quickly learned to eat at the royal table. But amidst these marvels are tales of a darker bent. Gervase devotes considerable ink to the malevolent machinations of demons, fairies, and other supernatural entities. He tells of infants stolen from their cradles by envious fae, of travellers led astray by will-o'-the-wisps, of pious monks tempted by succubi in the night. In one particularly chilling account, a noblewoman of Arles is seduced by a demon in the guise of a handsome knight. Only after bearing his monstrous offspring does she realize the true nature of her paramour. The demon coldly informs her that had she not uncovered his secret, he would have remained by her side until her death. Gervase presents these stories not as mere fictions, but as factual accounts gathered from eyewitnesses and reputable sources. For him, the realm of folklore was not a separate sphere from the natural world, but an integral part of it. Demons and monsters were as real as donkeys and millstones. This curious credulity was not uncommon among medieval scholars. In a world where the boundaries of scientific knowledge were still blurry, where the church taught that unseen forces could intercede in earthly affairs, tales of the uncanny could claim a veneer of truth. Yet even by the standards of his time, Gervas's Otia stands out for its sheer breadth of bizarre beliefs. It's a work that embodies the medieval mindset in all its wonder and terror, its fascination with the strange and the grotesque. In many ways, Gervas was a man caught between two worlds. As a cleric and courtier, he was steeped in the learning and sophistication of the High Middle Ages, yet his work is shot through with the remnants of an older, darker worldview, a pagan cosmos of capricious spirits and chthonic horrors. This tension between Christian orthodoxy and pagan superstition is nowhere more apparent than in Gervas's treatment of fairies. Like many of his contemporaries, he viewed these beings not as the whimsical sprites of later folklore, but as dangerous and deceptive entities capable of great harm. In the Otia, fairies are a constant threat to the unwary traveller or the unbaptized child. They lure men to their doom with unearthly music and beguiling illusions. They replace human infants with sickly, demonic changelings. They spirit away young women to serve as midwives in their otherworldly realms. Gervais tells of a Carthusian monk who stumbles upon a fairy banquet in the forest. Tempted by the sumptuous spread, he pockets a silver goblet as proof of his adventure. But when he returns to his monastery, the goblet has turned to dust, a grim reminder of the ephemeral nature of fairy glamour. In another tale, a young man is lured into a mountain by a beautiful fairy woman. For what seems like 3 days, he enjoys her hospitality and her bed. But when he emerges, he finds that 300 years have passed in the mortal world. His family and friends are long dead, and he himself crumbles to dust soon after. These stories reflect a deep ambivalence towards fairies in medieval culture. On the one hand, they were seen as alluring and otherworldly, possessing knowledge and powers beyond human ken. But they were also profoundly untrustworthy, prone to caprice and cruelty. This dangerous duality found its ultimate expression in the figure of the fairy mistress, a seductive fae who takes a human lover, only to abandon or destroy him in the end. In the Lays of Marie de France, the knight Lanval is blessed with the love of a beautiful fairy, but loses her forever when he breaks his vow of secrecy. Such cautionary tales serve to reinforce the Church's teachings on the dangers of temptation and the need for spiritual vigilance. Fairies, like demons, were seen as agents of the devil, luring the faithful away from the path of righteousness with false promises and fleeting pleasures. Yet even as clerics railed against the perils of fairy folk, there was a reluctant fascination with these uncanny creatures. In a world increasingly bound by religious doctrine and social hierarchy, fairies represented a tantalizing glimpse of the wild and the free, a return to an older, more primal way of being. This uneasy mix of attraction and repulsion, wonder and terror, runs throughout Gervais's Otia and much of medieval folklore. It's a world where the marvelous and the monstrous are two sides of the same coin, where the line between the real and the unreal is always shifting. In many ways, Gervas's compendium is a fitting symbol of the medieval mindset itself, a strange and often disturbing tapestry of faith and superstition, beauty and grotesquerie. A world where angels and demons walk among us, where the natural and the supernatural bleed together in unsettling ways. It's this unnerving yet intoxicating sensibility that continues to fascinate us today. In a world of science and reason, the irrational still exerts a powerful pull on our imaginations. The monsters and marvels of medieval folklore may no longer haunt our waking hours, but they linger still in the shadowy recesses of our collective psyche. So as we delve deeper into the disturbing world of medieval folklore, let's keep Gervais's curious spirit in mind. Let's approach these ancient tales with a mix of skepticism and wonder, reason and imagination. For in the end, the monsters without can tell us much about the monsters within. On that note, we'll leave Gervais and his unsettling menagerie for now. But don't worry, there are plenty more marvels and nightmares to come. In our next chapter, we'll encounter a different sort of medieval storyteller, one who used folklore as a tool for satire and social commentary. Until then, sweet dreams. As the medieval mind grappled with the mysteries of the natural world and the impenetrable workings of fate, folklore became a way to make sense of the inexplicable, to find meaning in the face of life's harsh realities. In an age where death was ever present, stalking the young and old alike, it's little wonder that the spectre of mortality loomed large in the popular imagination. One of the most enduring and unsettling motifs to emerge from this preoccupation with death was the dance of death, or danse macabre. This allegorical concept, which gained widespread currency in the late Middle Ages, vividly depicted the universality of death, showing how it would inevitably come for people of all stations and walks of life. In countless artworks from the period, we see the grim figure of death, often portrayed as a grinning skeleton, leading a procession of individuals from all rungs of the social ladder, kings and commoners, bishops and beggars, young and old, in a haunting dance toward the grave. These morbid tableaus served as a reminder of life's fleeting nature and the foolishness of earthly vanity in the face of our shared mortal destiny. The dance of death imagery reached its height of popularity in the 15th century, as Europe reeled from the devastating impact of recurring plague epidemics and seemingly endless warfare. In a world where death was a constant companion, such macabre motifs perhaps offered a strange sort of comfort, a reminder that no one, however wealthy or powerful, could escape the inexorable march of fate. Some of the most striking depictions of the dance of death can be found in the woodcut prints of the German artist Hans Holbein the Younger. Created in the 1520s, Holbein's intricate, almost satirical renderings show death intruding on the lives of people from all walks of life, a sardonic commentary on the futility of worldly striving. In one memorable scene, death accosts a plump abbot, eagerly pulling him into the dance as the clergyman clutches vainly at his rosary. In another, a knight in full armor attempts to fend off death's advances with his sword, a poignant reminder of the limits of earthly might. Kings, paupers, lovers, and merchants, all are equal partners in Holbein's morbid ballet. The dance of death was more than just a cultural meme. It served important social and religious functions as well. By depicting death as the great leveler, it reinforced the Church's message about the importance of leading a pious life and eschewing worldly temptations. At the same time, it gave expression to the profound anxieties and sense of helplessness that pervaded medieval society in the face of famine, plague, and war. Even as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and Enlightenment, the dance of death motif continued to exert a powerful hold on the European imagination. Its haunting imagery can be seen in everything from the ghoulish skeletons of Baroque tomb sculptures to the Gothic fantasies of the Romantic Age. Indeed, the unsettling symbolism of the danse macabre foreshadowed the emergence of the modern Gothic horror genre in the 18th century. In the fog-shrouded graveyards and crumbling castles of writers like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe, we can detect echoes of the medieval fascination with death and the uncanny. And what is Gothic fiction if not an exploration of those primal fears that haunted the medieval mind? The terror of the grave, the dread of the unknown, the uneasy sense that the boundary between the living and the dead is more porous than we'd like to believe. From the vampires and revenants of folk tales to the ghosts and ghouls of Gothic romance, the legacy of medieval folklore's morbid preoccupations lives on. Even in our modern, scientifically enlightened age, vestiges of these old superstitions and beliefs still linger, surfacing in everything from ghost stories around the campfire to the zombies and vampires that populate our movie screens and TV shows. Perhaps there's something deep in the human psyche that will always be drawn to the dark, the macabre, the things that go bump in the night. As we've seen, medieval folklore is a rich tapestry woven from strands of pagan superstition, Christian belief, and the timeless fears and fantasies that haunt the human imagination. From fairies and monsters to witches and walking corpses, the medieval world was alive with unsettling tales and eerie entities. But for all their strangeness and horror, these old stories also have much to tell us about the lived realities and mental landscapes of the people who told them. In a world where life was precarious and death always close at hand, folklore provided a way to make sense of the chaos, to find meaning and order in the face of the unknown. The medieval mind may seem alien and unsettling to us now, with its ready belief in the supernatural and its morbid fascination with death and the grotesque. But perhaps, in the end, the fears and fantasies it expressed are not so different from our own. After all, don't we still tell ourselves stories to cope with the darkness, to find a way through the uncharted wilderness of our own psyches? From the flickering shadows of the medieval fireside to the eerie glow of the movie screen, the power of folklore to disturb and delight us endures. As long as there is fear and wonder in the human heart, these old tales will continue to weave their spell, inviting us to peer into the dark mirrors of our own imaginations. And so, as we draw our exploration of medieval folklore to a close, we are left with a renewed appreciation for the power of stories to illuminate the human condition, to give shape and substance to our deepest fears and most ardent longings. In the end, perhaps the real lesson of these unsettling tales is that the monsters we imagine say more about us than they do about the world outside. They are reflections of the strange and marvelous workings of the human mind, in all its darkness and all its wonder. So the next time you find yourself shivering at a ghost story or jumping at a bump in the night, remember, you're part of an ancient tradition, one that stretches back through the centuries to the haunted forests and fog-shrouded castles of the medieval imagination. And who knows, perhaps someday, centuries from now, our own fears and fantasies will be the stuff of legend, the folklore of a future age, no less strange and unsettling than the tales that troubled the sleep of our medieval forebears. For in the end, the power of folklore lies not in the truth or falsity of its claims, but in its ability to give voice to the deepest, most primal stirrings of the human heart. It is a mirror held up to our own souls, reflecting back to us the wonders and the terrors that lurk within. And as long as there are stories to tell and imaginations to spin them, that mirror will never lose its power to enchant and unsettle us. So embrace the darkness, dear listener. Let the tales of the past whisper their secrets in your ear. And know that in the timeless realm of folklore, the boundary between the real and the imagined, the living and the dead, is ever a shifting, shadowy thing. Sweet dreams. As we've seen, medieval folklore was rife with tales of malevolent fairies and impish sprites that delighted in tormenting hapless humans. But perhaps no creature struck more fear into the medieval imagination than the werewolf. Since ancient times, there have been stories of men transforming into wolves. But in the Middle Ages, belief in werewolves reached a fever pitch. It was thought that a person could become a werewolf through witchcraft, a curse, or even donning a wolfskin belt. Once transformed, the werewolf was consumed by bestial urges, driven to stalk the forests and devour livestock, or even human prey. One notorious alleged werewolf was Peter Stump, a 16th century German farmer. Under torture, Stump confessed to practicing black magic for decades and transforming into a monstrous wolf. In his lupine form, he claimed to have killed and eaten 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and countless animals. While Stump's confession was extracted by horrific means, It reflects the very real paranoia about werewolves that gripped medieval society. But werewolves weren't the only beings thought to inhabit the wilderness outside human settlements. Many folk tales spoke of the Wodwos or wild man, a hairy, club-wielding humanoid creature that roamed the deep forests. Sometimes the wild man was depicted almost like a noble savage, possessing an uncorrupted, primal wisdom. But more often, he embodied the medieval fear of ungodly, uncivilized nature, red in tooth and claw. Perhaps the wild man represented anxieties about the tenuousness of medieval civilization and how quickly a man removed from society might revert to baser instincts. Across medieval literature and art, civilized life is often contrasted with the chaotic savagery of the wilderness, a precarious dichotomy that the wild man and werewolf threaten to upend. These bestial beings can be seen as liminal figures, straddling the boundary between man and beast, civilization and wilderness, order and chaos. They embody deep-seated fears about the animal lurking within the human, and the ever-present risk of people shedding their humanity and descending into monstrosity. It's fascinating to consider how these medieval preoccupations foreshadow later works of Gothic fiction and horror. The werewolf would stalk the pages of many a penny dreadful, and the trope of civilized people going native and regressing to savagery would be explored by authors like Joseph Conrad. Even the seemingly quaint wild man archetype arguably anticipates cryptids like Bigfoot that still haunt the modern imagination. So while tales of werewolves and wild men may seem outlandish to us now, for medieval people, these creatures were very much a part of their mental landscapes of fear. Lurking at the edges of the civilized world, they embodied the ever-present threat of humanity's wild nature, overwhelming the fragile trappings of civilization. But of course, the medieval terror of the monstrous was not confined merely to the world of beasts and cryptids. In many ways, the most horrific figure of all was that of the witch, the evil sorcerer who consorted with devils to cast curses and destroy the innocent. And it's to the medieval preoccupation with witchcraft that we turn our attention next. Throughout the Middle Ages, belief in magic and witchcraft was widespread. While the Church condemned sorcery as a demonic art, common folk often resorted to charms, spells, and potions for protection or to influence fate. Over time, the concept of the diabolical witch who gained malevolent powers through a pact with Satan became increasingly feared and reviled. The late Middle Ages saw a veritable witch craze, with witchcraft blamed for everything from blighting crops to souring milk to causing impotence. Accusations flew, and the mere hint of sorcery could turn neighbor against neighbor. Inquisitors and magistrates developed elaborate methods to prove a suspected witch's guilt, often through brutal means. One common test was the ordeal by water, in which the accused witch was stripped naked, bound, and thrown into a lake or river. If she sank, she was declared innocent, but if she floated, as an unnatural witch surely would, then she was guilty and promptly executed. Another notorious method was pricking a witch's skin to find the devil's mark, an insensitive spot where Satan's claw had touched her. Of course, such tests were heavily rigged against the accused from the start. Perhaps most influential in stoking the fires of witch-hunting fever was the 1487 treatise Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches. This lurid manual, written by German clergyman Heinrich Kramer, was filled with accounts of witches' evil deeds gained through torture and hearsay. It portrayed witchcraft as a vast, malevolent conspiracy against Christendom that needed to be ruthlessly stamped out. Kramer described witches as depraved women driven by perverse lust, who copulated with the devil and his demons at debauched sabbats. These sorceresses were accused of blighting crops, cursing enemies, corrupting priests and murdering babies. The ultimate early modern folk devils. The Malleus Maleficarum went on to become a kind of witch hunter's Bible, fueling the persecutions that would claim thousands of lives. mostly women, over the following centuries. It's difficult for us in the modern age to fathom the sheer paranoia and terror that the spectre of witchcraft evoked in the medieval mind. In a pre-scientific world plagued by famines, plagues, and misfortunes, witches represented a convenient scapegoat, the hidden hand of Satan sowing evil and destruction. And as with so much of medieval folklore, women often bore the brunt of men's fear and suspicion. While we may scoff at medieval witch tests and lurid accounts of demonic pacts, echoes of this moral panic sadly persist even today. We still use terms like witch hunt to describe a baseless campaign of persecution, often against vulnerable targets. And the grim legacy of medieval witchcraft beliefs can arguably be traced in modern conspiracies about satanic cabals and the Illuminati. So as we ponder the disturbing world of medieval folklore, it's worth reflecting on how these fearful superstitions and irrational beliefs are never as far behind us as we might think. The specific threats may change with the times, but sadly, human nature remains much the same, ever prone to imagining evil and monstrosity lurking in the shadows. One particularly unnerving aspect of medieval lore was the belief in ghosts, revenants, and the restless dead. In an age of plagues and warfare, death was an ever-present spectre, and tales abounded of ghostly visitations and corpses rising from the grave to torment the living. The medieval view of death was often a macabre one, coloured by grim images and memento mori. In the wake of the devastating Black Death, gruesome depictions known as the Danse Macabre or Dance of Death became common, showing skeletons and rotting cadavers leading the living in a grim procession to the grave. These morbid allegories were meant to convey the universality of death and the fleeting nature of earthly vanities. But beyond allegorical skeletons, medieval folklore was rife with stories of very real ghosts and revenants stalking the land of the living. Many believed that those who died unshriven of their sins or suffered a particularly violent end were doomed to walk the earth as tormented spirits. Murderers, heretics, excommunicants, all were prime candidates to return as vengeful spectres. The 12th century English clergyman William of Newburgh chronicled many tales of sinful priests and corrupt noblemen rising from their tombs as grotesque, bloated corpses, spreading pestilence and assaulting the living. In one account, villagers even resorted to digging up a revenant corpse and burning its heart to banish the undead menace. Such grisly tales of the restless dead have obvious parallels with later vampire lore, and indeed, the medieval revenant can be seen as a precursor to the blood-sucking fiends of Gothic fiction. But for medieval folk, these were not mere chilling stories. They were very real perils to guard against. Numerous funerary practices emerged to prevent a corpse from rising again, such as placing heavy stones on the grave, burying bodies face down, or even staking suspected revenants through the heart. Apotropaic items like garlic, iron nails, or holy water were also employed in an attempt to keep the dead at rest. All of this macabre lore reflects the deep-seated medieval anxiety around death and decay, and the pervasive belief that the veil between the living and the dead was perilously thin. In an age where mortality loomed so large, is it any wonder that ghosts and ghouls featured so prominently in the medieval imagination? Even today, tales of hauntings and undead horrors retain their power to unsettle us on a primal level. While we may not share the superstitions of our medieval ancestors, the fear of death and what lies beyond is one that still runs deep in the human psyche. Through spine-chilling ghost stories and eerie tales of the walking dead, we continue to grapple with our own mortality and ponder the great unknowns that await us all in the end. And so, as our journey through the dark mythos of medieval Europe draws to a close, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the enduring allure of these unsettling legends. Even across the vast gulf of centuries, the folklore of the Middle Ages still captivates us with its raw, primal power. Perhaps it's because these grim tales speak to something deep within the human condition, our perennial fears of the dark, of the unknown, of the beast within and without. By confronting these anxieties through myth and legend, medieval folk sought to impose some sense of meaning and order on a perilous and often inscrutable world. And while the dragons and wild men, witches and revenants of medieval lore may seem outlandish to modern sensibilities, they nonetheless laid the groundwork for so many enduring motifs in horror and Gothic fiction. Without the monstrous template of the werewolf, we wouldn't have tales like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that explore the duality of human nature. Without the diabolical villainy of the witch, we wouldn't have iconic characters like Dracula, emblems of evil's seductive allure. So in a sense, when we consume modern horror media, when we eagerly devour the latest Stephen King novel, or lose ourselves in a scary Netflix series, we are participating in a grand storytelling tradition that stretches back to those fearful folk huddled around the medieval hearth, swapping shuddersome stories of the unquiet dead. Because while the trappings and technologies of our world would be unrecognizable to our medieval forebears, the human heart, with all its midnight dreads and macabre imaginings, remains essentially unchanged. We are still those anxious, hairless apes jumping at shadows in the night, still weaving intricate myths to make sense of the senseless and shield ourselves from the void. So perhaps the real lesson to take from this morbid survey of medieval folklore is one about the enduring power of stories, to captivate, to unnerve, and above all, to bind us together as a species united in our primal fears and yearnings. And though the tales may change with the telling, that uncanny connection, that shiver down the spine, is one that echoes through the ages, as timeless as it is terrifying. As the Black Death stalked the land, it amplified existing fears of the supernatural and the demonic. The medieval mind, already primed with tales of vampires, revenants and witchcraft, saw the devastating pandemic as punishment from God or the work of malevolent forces. Villages decimated by plague were said to be cursed, while individuals who miraculously survived were sometimes accused of colluding with dark powers. Amidst this climate of dread, the allegory of the danse macabre, or dance of death, gained renewed urgency. The motif, which first emerged in the late 13th century, vividly depicted the universality of death, showing skeletal figures leading people from all walks of life in a grim procession to the grave. Kings and paupers, knights and clergymen, young and old, none were spared death's inevitable summons. One of the earliest known visual depictions of the danse macabre adorned the cloisters of the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, painted in the aftermath of the Black Death in the late 1420s. Though lost to time, surviving fragments and etchings attest to its striking imagery. The mural portrayed a series of figures from various social stations, each accompanied by an animated corpse as their ghoulish dance partner. Eerie, yet darkly humorous, it served as a grim reminder of life's fleeting nature. Across Europe, the dance of death appeared in church frescoes, manuscripts, woodcuts, and even the emerging medium of printed books. One particularly famous series of woodcuts was created by the German artist Hans Holbein the Younger in the 1520s. With intricate detail and biting social commentary, Holbein depicted death infiltrating every sphere of human activity, rudely interrupting the living in both mundane and momentous scenes. While the Black Death was undoubtedly a catalyst for the spread of the danse macabre, the motif also reflected a broader late medieval preoccupation with human mortality. The ravages of plague were compounded by the carnage of the 100 Years' War and frequent famines, making death an ever-present spectre for rich and poor alike. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish and short, Macabre imagery became a way to confront and even mock the Grim Reaper's power. The Dance of Death was more than just a morbid, artistic trope, however. It also served a moralizing function, reminding viewers of the importance of living a virtuous life in preparation for Judgment Day. Many depictions included skeletons holding mirrors, hourglasses or shovels, symbolizing vanity's folly and time's inexorable march. Preachers seized upon the allegory to warn against earthly attachment and extol the eternal, as church walls and cemeteries became canvases for ghastly memento mori. Yet even as the Dance of Death promulgated a message of pious detachment, it also conveyed a certain egalitarian undertone. By presenting death as the great leveler, the motif subtly critiqued the rigid social hierarchies of the age. Peasants could take grim satisfaction in seeing death rudely yank bishops and barons into the great beyond. The richer and more powerful, it implied, had just as far to fall as the lowly and meek. The appeal of the danse macabre gradually waned in the centuries following the medieval period, but its haunting imagery left an indelible mark on the European psyche. Echoes can be seen in the ghastly skeletons adorning Elizabethan memento mori rings, the ghoulish phantasmagoria of Victorian Gothic fiction, and the skeletal protagonists of modern films like The Seventh Seal and Coco. Even today, as we euphemistically speak of death and taxes, or cynically jest that the graveyard is the only true democracy, we unknowingly channel that quintessentially medieval gallows humour in the face of life's one universal constant. The Dance of Death may have emerged from the particular anxieties of the medieval world, but it tapped into deeper human fears and fascinations. The unsettling idea that death could come for anyone at any time, the wry catharsis in confronting it through morbid humour, the conviction that how we face our end matters more than earthly status. These are sentiments that still resonate across the centuries. Medieval men and women found some cold comfort in the danse macabre. So too might we recognise our common fate in its grinning, ghastly ranks. But the impact of medieval folklore extends well beyond the Dance of Death. The unsettling tales and superstitions of the Middle Ages, however alien they may seem to us today, laid the foundations for many enduring facets of popular culture. From the vampires and werewolves of Gothic fiction to the witches and fairies of modern fantasy, the archetypes born in medieval storytelling continue to stalk our collective imagination. Consider, for instance, the vampire, that undead creature of the night who subsists on the blood of the living. While the term vampire itself only emerged in the 18th century, the idea of malevolent revenants who preyed upon humans dates back to ancient times. But it was in the medieval period that these disparate folk beliefs coalesced into something resembling the literary vampires we know today. Medieval chroniclers wrote of creatures called revenants or Nachtzehrer, shambling corpses that rose from the grave to terrorize their former communities. These undead beings were often associated with outbreaks of plague, as if the pestilence itself had reanimated the dead. To prevent their nocturnal predations, various gruesome measures were prescribed, such as driving stakes through corpses or placing bricks in their mouths. Such lurid tales paved the way for the first true literary vampires of the 18th century, like the titular terror in John Polidori's 1819 story, The Vampire. Later Victorian writers such as Sheridan Le Fanu and Bram Stoker fleshed out the vampire mythos, drawing heavily on Eastern European folklore with medieval roots. Even as vampires have evolved in popular culture, from the tormented romanticism of Anne Rice's Lestat to the sparkly heartthrobs of Twilight, they still retain traces of their medieval forebears, the undead revenant, the plague-bringer, the seducer and despoiler. Werewolves, too, can trace their literary lineage back to the Middle Ages. While tales of humans transforming into animals are found in the mythologies of many cultures, the specific idea of the werewolf, a man who becomes a ravening beast under the full moon, took shape in medieval folklore. Werewolves were seen as embodiments of man's bestial nature, the id unleashed by diabolical or occult forces. One of the earliest recorded werewolf tales comes from the 12th century chronicler Gervase of Tilbury, who recounted the story of a nobleman encounters a talking wolf in a forest. The wolf reveals himself to be a cursed knight, condemned to spend years in lupine form as penance for his sins. This sympathetic, even tragic portrayal presages later literary werewolves like the tortured protagonists of Guy Endor's The Werewolf of Paris or Universal's The Wolfman. Of course, not all medieval monsters received such nuanced treatment in modern adaptations. The wild men, those hirsute, club-wielding savages believed to haunt the untamed forests, evolved into the dim-witted, lumbering ogres of fairy tales and fantasy. Dragons, while still presented as formidable foes, often lost their satanic associations, becoming symbols of elemental chaos or even noble beasts in their own right. And the fairies of medieval lore, those capricious, often malevolent creatures who meddled in mortal affairs, underwent perhaps the most radical transformation of all. In the saccharine realm of Disney and Victorian children's tales, fairies became tiny, twinkly beings, more prone to mischief than malice. Only in recent years have writers like Susanna Clarke and Neil Gaiman sought to recapture some of the dangerous allure of the medieval fairies, those perilous spirits who haunted the wild places beyond human dominion. But it is not just the creatures and characters of medieval folklore that have endured in our modern imagination. The deeper themes and anxieties they embody still resonate with us, even if we are less inclined to interpret misfortune through a supernatural lens. The fear of the other, the unknown, the liminal, these are human constants, and the medieval mind simply clothed them in the garb of the monstrous and the uncanny. When medieval peasants spun tales of witches blighting crops or changelings supplanting children, they were grappling with the capricious cruelty of fate in a world where so much lay beyond their control or comprehension. When they populated the wild places with dragons and woodwoocies, they were projecting their fears of the untamed and the uncivilized onto the landscape. And when they whispered of revenants stalking plague-ridden villages, they were confronting the implacable spectre of death in a time of harrowing mortality. These anxieties may take different forms today, but they have not vanished. We still fear the stranger, the unknown, the uncontrollable. We still seek to make sense of seemingly senseless misfortune through storytelling, even if we dress it up in the language of conspiracy theories or moral panics rather than hexes and curses. And we still, on some deep level, shiver at the thought of what might lurk in the shadows, of what primal chaos might rear its head and upend our neatly ordered lives. This, perhaps, is the enduring power and fascination of medieval folklore. For all its strangeness and superstition, it speaks to something deeply, perennially human. Those eerie tales whispered by hearthfires on long winter nights. Those unsettling creatures etched into the margins of manuscripts and the vaults of churches. They give shape to the nameless fears and desires that have haunted us since we first started spinning stories to make sense of the world and our place in it. So the next time you shudder at a vampire's unquenchable thirst, or thrill at a witch's arcane curse, or ponder a ghost's unfinished business, pause and remember the medieval men and women who first gave form to these enduring archetypes. They may have lived in a world very different from our own, steeped in superstition and beset by unimaginable hardships. But through their folklore, they etched a portrait of the human condition in all its macabre splendor. A portrait that still has the power to unsettle, beguile, and resonate, hundreds of years after the last medieval storyteller fell silent. Our journey through the dark and fascinating world of medieval folklore has come to a close. From the fire-breathing dragons and capricious fairies to the vengeful revenants and diabolical witches, we've seen how the medieval imagination populated the world with a panoply of supernatural entities. These beings embodied the hopes, fears, and anxieties of a society grappling with famine, war, plague, and religious upheaval. A society where the veil between the natural and the supernatural often seemed perilously thin. We've met the chroniclers and storytellers who preserved these eerie tales for posterity. Men like Gervase of Tilbury, Walter Map, and Johannes Nider, who trawled the highways and byways of folklore, even as they grappled with theological and philosophical conundrums. And we've seen how medieval folklore laid the foundations for many enduring genres of popular culture, from Gothic literature to modern horror cinema. But more than that, our exploration of medieval folklore has held up a mirror to the human psyche itself. For all their strangeness and specificity, these tales speak to universal fears and desires, the terror of the unknown, the longing for justice in an often capricious world, the uneasy awareness of our own mortality. They remind us that for all our technological and scientific advances, we are still the same storytelling species, spinning yarns to make sense of the world and our place in it. So let us not dismiss the folklore of the Middle Ages as mere peasant superstition or historical curiosity. Let us instead marvel at the ingenuity and resilience of the medieval mind, which confronted the darkest aspects of the human experience and transmuted them into tales of wonder, horror, and cautionary wisdom. And let us appreciate how those tales continue to resonate down the centuries, speaking to the deep reservoirs of fear and awe within us all. The medieval world may be long gone, but its dreams and nightmares still haunt us. The faces and names may change, but the stories remain, told and retold around campfires, in books and films and video games, wherever people gather to peer into the darkness and wonder what might be peering back. In this way, the folklore of the Middle Ages lives on, an unbroken thread of storytelling, stretching back to when our ancestors first huddled around hearths and whispered of the monsters in the shadows. And so we come to the end of our journey through the disturbing and captivating world of medieval folklore. But the tales, of course, go on, as they always have and always will, as long as there are stories to tell and people to listen in rapt, shivering attention. For in the end, perhaps that is the true magic of folklore, its power to bind us together across the ages, to remind us of our shared hopes and fears, our common humanity in the face of the vast unknown. The medieval men and women who first gave voice to these tales may be long gone, but their legacy endures. So the next time you hear a strange bump in the night, or feel a sudden shiver down your spine, or find yourself wondering what might lurk just beyond the firelight, remember the storytellers of old and the unquiet ghosts they conjured with their words. And know that you are part of an ancient, ongoing conversation between the human imagination and the dark mysteries of the world. And with that thought, dear listener, I bid you good night. May your dreams be untroubled by the spectres of the past, or if they are, may you find in them not terror, but a strange and thrilling wonder. For in the end, perhaps that is the greatest gift of medieval folklore. The reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures and finds a way to spin light and meaning from the shadows. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the haunted landscapes of the medieval mind. Until next time, may your own story be filled with magic, wonder, and just a touch of the deliciously macabre. As we delve deeper into the macabre menagerie of medieval folklore, we come face to face with some of the most chilling and disturbing creatures believed to stalk the dark forests and murky swamps of medieval Europe. These were not the charming, sanitized fairy tale characters of modern children's stories. No, these were malevolent entities, born of primal fears and ancient superstitions, ready to drag hapless humans to their doom. Perhaps no creature struck more terror into the medieval heart than the werewolf. The idea of a man transforming into a ravenous wolf-like beast under the light of the full moon is one of the most enduring and pervasive myths in folklore around the world. But in medieval Europe, werewolf beliefs took on a particularly sinister and diabolical character. Werewolves, or lycanthropes as they were sometimes called, were seen as humans who had made a pact with the devil, selling their souls in exchange for the ability to shapeshift into wolves. This transformation was said to grant them superhuman strength, speed, and bloodlust, turning them into the perfect killing machines. By day, they might appear as normal men and women, but when the moon rose full and bright in the night sky, they would shed their human skins and become snarling, insatiable beasts. Medieval accounts of werewolf attacks were vivid and terrifying. In his 12th century work, Topographia Hibernica, the scholar Giraldus Cambrensis tells of a priest travelling through a forest in Ireland who stumbled upon two wolves. These wolves spoke to him with human voices, explaining that they were a man and woman from Ossory, cursed to become wolves every 7 years as penance for their sins. The priest, moved by their plight, administered last rites to the she-wolf who was near death. Upon vanishing into the forest, the male wolf returned with a sheep carcass to feed his dying companion, a strangely poignant scene amidst the horror. Another famous werewolf story from the medieval period concerns a Livonian peasant named Thys. In 1692, Thys openly admitted to being a werewolf before a court, but claimed he was one of the hounds of God who descended into hell 3 times a year to battle witches and wizards to ensure a good harvest. This account, recorded by the Baltic German scholar Karl Hermann, provides a fascinating glimpse into the complex folklore surrounding werewolves, where they were not always seen as purely evil, but sometimes as ambivalent or even beneficial figures. But the medieval fear of werewolves was not just confined to folklore and travelers' tales. It had very real and tragic consequences. In 1521, 2 men, Pierre Bergeau and Michel Verdun, were executed in Poligny, France, after confessing under torture to being werewolves and devouring several children. Their trial was overseen by the Inquisitor General of Besançon, who wrote a lengthy treatise on werewolves and their supposed diabolical nature. This was just one of many werewolf trials that occurred in medieval Europe, as authorities sought to root out and destroy these perceived monsters in human form. The origins of the werewolf myth are ancient and varied, with shape-shifting humans appearing in the folklore of many cultures. But the medieval Christian Church gave werewolf beliefs a decidedly demonic twist. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that only God had the power to truly transform one creature into another, so any human shapeshifter must be doing so through the power of the devil. This tied werewolves to the growing medieval obsession with witchcraft and heresy, making them not just bloodthirsty brutes, but agents of Satan himself. Werewolves also embodied deep-seated anxieties about the blurry boundary between man and beast, civilization and savagery. The medieval wilderness was seen as a place of danger and darkness, where wild animals and even wilder men lurked, ready to prey upon innocent travelers. Werewolves represented the ultimate fear of the wild consuming and corrupting the human, dragging men down into a state of animalistic depravity. This fear found expression in another common medieval motif, the wild man or woodwoes. These were hairy, naked, club-wielding men believed to haunt the deep forests of medieval Europe. They were sometimes depicted as noble savages, possessing a raw, primal strength and connection to nature. But more often, they were seen as brutish and dangerous, the antithesis of the civilized courtly man. In medieval art, wild men were often shown being tamed or conquered by knights and saints, symbolizing the triumph of Christian civilization over pagan savagery. But they also served as a reminder of the wildness that lurked within all men, the beast that could take over if one strayed too far from the path of righteousness. Both werewolves and wild men reflected the medieval belief in the inherent sinfulness and weakness of the flesh. The body was seen as a wild, unruly thing, constantly threatening to drag the soul down into depravity if not harshly controlled. In a world where disease, famine, and violence were everyday realities, the idea that the monster might dwell within, that one's own body could betray and destroy the self, was a terrifying thought. But medieval werewolf and wildman legends were not just expressions of fear and loathing for the body and the natural world. They also served as cautionary tales, warning of the dangers of social and moral transgression. To become a werewolf was to abandon one's humanity, to give in to base, animalistic impulses, and violate the God-given order of things. Wild men, too, represented a state of being outside the bounds of civilized society, a regression to a primitive pre-Christian state of savagery. In this sense, werewolf and wild man stories reinforce the importance of cleaving to one's proper place in the social hierarchy, of submitting to authority both secular and religious. To stray from the path, to give in to temptation and sin, was to risk losing not just one's soul, but one's very humanity. As the Middle Ages progressed, werewolf beliefs began to merge and overlap with the growing witch hunts that swept across Europe. Accused witches were often charged with shape-shifting into animals, including wolves, to carry out their nefarious deeds. The ability to transform into a wolf became yet another supposed sign of a witch's diabolical pact, further blurring the lines between folklore and reality. One particularly infamous case was that of Peter Stump, a German farmer executed in 1589. Under torture, Stump confessed to being a werewolf for over 25 years, claiming the devil had given him a magic belt that allowed him to transform into a monstrous wolf. In this form, he claimed to have killed and eaten 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and countless livestock. Stump was brutally executed on the breaking wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs broken, and his body finally beheaded. His head was placed on a pole as a warning to other would-be werewolves and witches. The Stump case highlights the increasingly sadistic and hysterical nature of werewolf and witch trials in the later medieval and early modern period. No longer just the stuff of campfire tales and lurid travelers' accounts. The werewolf had become a very real monster in the eyes of authorities, a demonic threat that had to be mercilessly rooted out and destroyed. But even as the smoke from the pyres of accused werewolves and witches began to fade, the werewolf's hold on the medieval imagination remained strong. In popular festivals like the Bavarian Fastnacht, revelers would dress up in wolf pelts and masks, evoking the wild man and werewolf legends in a strange blend of celebration and superstition. Even today, the image of the werewolf as a tortured, cursed soul, struggling against its own beastly nature, remains a potent and enduring one in horror fiction and film. Medieval werewolf legends, then, offer a fascinating and unsettling glimpse into the fears, anxieties, and beliefs of the time. They reflect a world where the boundary between man and beast, civilization and savagery, was seen as fragile and easily transgressed. A world where the monster was not just an external threat, but a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked within the human heart. In a time when life was often nasty, brutish, and short, when the wilderness seemed to press in on all sides, waiting to consume the unwary, Tales of werewolves and wild men served as dark fables of the need to cling to one's humanity in the face of a hostile and terrifying universe. They warned of the dire consequences of giving in to sin, of straying from the narrow path of Christian virtue. But they also perhaps served as a strange sort of wish fulfillment, a fantasy of escaping the rigid confines of medieval society and indulging the primal, animalistic side of human nature. After all, there is a dark allure to the idea of the werewolf. The notion of shedding the constraints of civilization, of running free and wild under the pale light of the moon, even if only for a night. In the end, the medieval werewolf remains a potent and enduring symbol of the darkness that dwells within us all, the beast that sleeps fitfully beneath the thin veneer of human civilization. A reminder that no matter how far we may think we have come from our primitive, superstitious past, the wild still calls to us, whispering in our blood and our bones. And so we continue to tell stories of werewolves and wild men, just as our medieval ancestors did. Because in these dark fables, we confront both our deepest fears and our darkest desires. We grapple with what it means to be human in a world that is often red in tooth and claw, and we remind ourselves again and again of the importance of holding fast to our humanity, even as the beast within howls to the uncaring moon. From werewolves, our journey through the haunted forests of medieval folklore now takes us to an encounter with another beloved and feared figure of the time, the witch. In the medieval imagination, witches were malevolent sorcerers, usually women, who had traded their souls to Satan in exchange for dark, occult powers. The roots of medieval witch beliefs are complex and varied, drawing on a heady mix of pagan folklore, Christian theology, and classical mythology. Many of the characteristics associated with witches, riding broomsticks, brewing potions in cauldrons, cavorting with demons, have their origins in earlier European legends of malevolent spirits and goddesses. But it was in the Middle Ages that these disparate beliefs coalesced into the figure of the witch as we now know it. This was in large part due to the influence of the Christian Church, which saw witchcraft as a direct threat to its power and authority. To medieval theologians, witches were not just misguided pagans or folk healers, but active agents of Satan, engaged in a cosmic struggle against the forces of good. The 13th century saw the birth of the Inquisition, a powerful office within the Catholic Church tasked with rooting out heresy. As the Inquisition's power grew, so too did the Church's obsession with witchcraft. Inquisitors like Bernard Guy and Nicholas Aymeric wrote extensive treatises on the supposed practices and identifying marks of witches, laying the groundwork for the full-blown witch hunts of the early modern period. But it was not until the 15th century that the witch craze truly took hold in medieval Europe. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the infamous Bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, which explicitly condemned witchcraft as a heresy against the Church. 2 years later, the notorious witch-hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, was published by the German inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The Malleus Maleficarum was a lurid and deeply misogynistic work, reflecting the pervasive belief in the inherent weakness and wickedness of women. It portrayed witches as depraved servants of Satan, who flew to nocturnal assemblies known as sabbats, where they worshipped the devil, engaged in orgies, and plotted to destroy Christian society. The book also provided detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and execute suspected witches. Armed with this powerful ideological weapon, medieval witch hunters set to their grim work with renewed zeal. Across Europe, accusations of witchcraft multiplied, fueled by a toxic mix of superstition, misogyny, and religious fervor. Women were particularly vulnerable to these accusations, as they were seen as weaker in faith and more susceptible to the devil's influence. One of the most notorious witch trials of the medieval period took place in the French town of Arras in 1459. A condemned murderer named Robinet de Vaux, seeking to avoid execution, claimed that he was part of a widespread witch cult that included many prominent citizens of the town. This sparked a wave of accusations and arrests as panic and hysteria gripped the populace. Under torture, the accused confessed to an array of lurid and fantastical crimes. They admitted to attending sabbats, worshipping a demon in the form of a goat, and engaging in cannibalism and infanticide. They also claimed to have used their occult powers to blight crops, cause disease, and murder their enemies. In the end, 12 people were burned at the stake as a result of the Arras trials. But the impact of the trials went far beyond the fates of the individual accused. They helped to cement the image of the witch as a malevolent, Satan-worshipping threat to Christian society in the medieval imagination. This image was further reinforced by popular works of art and literature, such as Albrecht Dürer's engraving The Four Witches and Hans Baldung Green's painting Witches' Sabbath. These grotesque sexualized depictions of witches engaging in diabolical acts served to fuel the growing hysteria and fear surrounding witchcraft. But even as the witch hunts reached their fever pitch, there were some voices of reason and skepticism. The Dutch physician Johann Weyer, in his 1563 work De Praestigiis Daemonum, argued that accused witches were not servants of Satan, but mentally ill women who had been deluded by the devil. Weyer's work was groundbreaking in its attempt to provide a medical and psychological explanation for the supposed phenomena of witchcraft. However, Weyer's arguments were largely drowned out by the clamor of the witch hunters. The persecution of alleged witches continued to escalate throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, reaching its horrific apex with the mass witch trials of the early modern period. It's estimated that between 40,000 and 60,000 people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft in Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries. The legacy of the medieval witch hunts is a dark and disturbing one. They reflect a time when superstition, misogyny, and religious fanaticism combined to create an atmosphere of terror and persecution. Countless innocent lives were destroyed on the pyre and the rack, as the spectre of the witch loomed large in the medieval psyche. But the witch hunts also reveal something deeper about the human psyche: our propensity to demonize and destroy that which we fear and do not understand. The figure of the witch became a scapegoat for all the ills and anxieties of medieval society, from crop failures and disease outbreaks to sexual frustration and social upheaval. In a world where life was precarious and the forces of nature seemed capricious and often cruel, the witch represented a malevolent, supernatural threat that could be identified, confronted, and ultimately destroyed. By hunting and burning witches, medieval society sought to assert control over the chaos and uncertainty of existence, to create an illusion of order in a fundamentally disordered world. Today, the figure of the witch has undergone a remarkable transformation in popular culture. No longer the malevolent hag of medieval legend, the modern witch is often portrayed as a symbol of feminine power, a wise woman in tune with the forces of nature. This reclaiming of the witch archetype reflects a broader shift in our understanding of gender, power, and spirituality. But the dark history of the witch hunts remains as a warning from our medieval past. It reminds us of the dangers of ignorance, fear, and fanaticism, of the human capacity for cruelty and injustice in the face of the unknown. It is a grim testament to the power of superstition and the fragility of reason, a haunting reminder of the monsters we create in our own image. As we delve ever deeper into the shadowy realms of medieval folklore, we find ourselves confronted again and again with the blurred boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, the human and the monstrous. In a world where life was often short, brutal, and unpredictable, These dark tales served as a way to make sense of the chaos, to give shape and form to the nameless terrors that stalked the edges of the firelight. From the ravenous werewolves prowling the forests to the malevolent witches brewing their potions in the shadows, the creatures of medieval folklore embody the deepest fears and anxieties of a society living in a constant state of precarity. They are the manifestations of the wild, untamed forces that threaten to engulf the fragile order of medieval life at any moment. But these monsters also serve as dark mirrors for the human condition, reflecting back to us our own capacity for savagery, for transgression, for the violation of sacred bonds and taboos. In the figure of the werewolf, we confront the beast within, the primal animalistic urges that lurk beneath the veneer of. As Gervase of Tilbury regaled his readers with disturbing tales of devilish imps and sinister spirits, another 12th century scholar was also chronicling the bizarre beliefs of his time. Walter Map, a courtier in the service of King Henry II of England, left behind a strange compendium known as De Nugis Curialium, or Courtier's Trifles. Despite the dismissive title, Map's eclectic collection of anecdotes, rumours, and folklore provides a fascinating glimpse into the medieval imagination. Born around 1140 in Herefordshire, Walter Map studied at the University of Paris before entering royal service. He held various ecclesiastical positions, including a canonship at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and the office of Chancellor of Lincoln. But it was Map's role as a courtier and diplomat that gave him access to a wealth of stories and gossip from across Europe. In De Nugis Curialium, Map presents these nuggets of information in a satirical, often tongue-in-cheek style. His irreverent tone sets him apart from more sober chroniclers like Gervase of Tilbury. Map delights in poking fun at the foibles of the nobility and clergy, painting a picture of a court rife with scandal and intrigue. But amidst the barbed witticisms, Map also relates a number of unsettling supernatural tales. One memorable account tells of a young man from Herefordshire who ventures into a dense forest and encounters a strange being. A spectral knight astride a jet-black horse. The ghostly figure challenges the youth to a jousting match, promising great rewards if he wins. Tempted by greed, the young man agrees, only to be unhorsed and dragged away to the knight's unearthly realm, never to be seen again. Map presents this story as a moral warning against the dangers of pride and avarice. But it also reflects a common medieval belief in supernatural entities lurking at the edges of the human world, ready to lure the unwary to their doom. Like the fairies and demons described by Gervase of Tilbury, Map's Phantom Knight inhabits a liminal space between the natural and the uncanny. Another tale in De Nugis Curialium hints at the medieval fascination with shape-shifting creatures. Map recounts the story of a soldier named Sceva, who discovers that his wife is secretly a witch. Each night, she anoints herself with a magic salve that allows her to transform into a raven and fly away. Curious, Sceva tries the ointment himself and turns into a hawk. He flies to a nearby house where he witnesses a gathering of witches, including his wife, plotting evil deeds. This anecdote foreshadows the growing obsession with witchcraft that would grip Europe in the coming centuries. The idea of humans, especially women, transforming into animals was a common trope in medieval witch trials. It played on deep-seated fears about the blurring of boundaries between the human and the bestial. Map's witch story also reflects the misogynistic attitudes of the time, which cast women as inherently prone to deception and sin. This suspicion of the feminine was deeply entangled with superstitions about magic and demonic seduction. In the centuries to come, it would fuel the fires of the witch hunts that claimed countless lives. Throughout De Nugis Curialium, Walter Map walks a fine line between credulity and skepticism. He relates supernatural stories with a straight face, but also hints at their dubious veracity. Mapp's ambiguous stance reflects the complex attitudes of medieval intellectuals toward folklore and superstition. While many scholars denounce belief in fairies and magic as peasant ignorance or pagan delusion, they also couldn't resist the lure of a good ghost story. For Walter Map and his contemporaries, tales of the uncanny served both as entertainment and as moral instruction. They warned of the dangers of straying from the path of Christian virtue, while also titillating audiences with glimpses of a darker, more mysterious world. Map's impish prose style, full of clever wordplay and sly asides, heightens this sense of ambiguity. Is he mocking the tall tales he relates, even as he claims to believe them? In one memorable passage, Map describes a greedy cleric who exacts unlawful tolls from his parishioners. As divine punishment, the priest is haunted by a talking fox who disrupts his sermons with sarcastic japes. Whenever the cleric preaches about the evils of greed, the fox interjects with cries of, "You should know." Map presents this tale of a humiliated hypocrite as just desserts for clerical corruption. But he also seems to delight in the comic absurdity of a man arguing with a supernaturally garrulous woodland creature. Like his contemporary Gervase of Tilbury, Walter Map was a man of his time, steeped in the superstitions and folklore of the Middle Ages, yet also struggling to make sense of them through the lens of Christian doctrine and classical learning. His De Nugis Curialium is a monument to the medieval fascination with the bizarre, the miraculous, and the downright unsettling. Map's book enjoyed wide circulation, with over 50 manuscript copies surviving to the present day. Its influence can be seen in later medieval writers like Gerald of Wales, who also dabbled in tales of the supernatural. Some scholars have even suggested that Map's work may have influenced the development of Arthurian legend, with its rich vein of magical marvels and uncanny encounters. But Walter Map's true legacy lies in the enduring power of the stories he helped to preserve. His irreverent retellings of age-old folk tales and snippets of medieval rumour offer us a glimpse into the fears and fantasies of a long-vanished world. Like the mischievous sprites and impish fairies that haunt the pages of De Nugis Curialium, Map's tall tales continue to work their magic on our imaginations, unsettling and enchanting us in equal measure. As the Middle Ages wore on, belief in malevolent fairies and shape-shifting witches would take an increasingly dark turn. The once playful folk traditions of an earlier era would be recast as diabolical threats, to be stamped out by zealous inquisitors. Lurking beneath the surface of Walter Map's satirical sallies and Gervase of Tilbury's earnest anecdotes were the seeds of a more sinister strain of superstition. In the centuries to come, the medieval obsession with the uncanny would reach a terrible crescendo in the witch hunts that swept across Europe. Countless innocent lives would be destroyed by the fear and paranoia, unleashed by this twisted fusion of folklore and religious fervour. At the centre of this storm of superstition was a figure who came to embody the darkest aspects of medieval belief in the supernatural, the witch. The archetype of the wicked witch, a malevolent, typically female sorcerer who cavorted with demons and wreaked havoc on good Christian folk, had deep roots in medieval folklore. Long before the first witch trials of the early modern era, tales of diabolical witchcraft circulated throughout Europe. These stories drew on a rich brew of pagan superstitions, biblical traditions, and misogynistic stereotypes. In the popular imagination, witches were seen as the antithesis of proper Christian womanhood. Instead of being chaste, obedient, and pious, they were portrayed as lustful, rebellious, and utterly depraved. Accused witches were often poor, elderly women who lived on the margins of society. Their very existence seemed to threaten the paternalistic order of the medieval world. The late Middle Ages saw an upsurge in fear and fascination with witchcraft, fueled in part by the trauma of the Black Death and the social upheaval of the period. As the old feudal order crumbled and traditional beliefs were challenged by new ideas, many clung ever more tightly to superstition as a source of certainty in an uncertain world. It was in this charged atmosphere that witch trials began to proliferate across Europe. The first major outbreak occurred in the French-Swiss border region in the early 15th century. Over the next 200 years, witch hunts would claim an estimated 50,000 lives, the vast majority of them women. The methods used to root out suspected witches were as cruel as they were absurd. Accused women were subjected to brutal interrogations, often under torture, until they confessed to fantastical crimes like flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons and blighting crops. Once a confession was extracted, the alleged witch was typically sentenced to death by burning at the stake. One of the most influential texts in the burgeoning field of witch hunting was the Formicarius, or Book of Ants, written by the German theologian Johannes Nieder in the 1430s. Nieder was a Dominican friar and religious reformer who saw the fight against witchcraft as part of a broader crusade to purify the church and stamp out heresy. In the Formicarius, Nieder paints a lurid picture of witches as depraved servants of Satan, who renounced their baptism and engaged in all manner of unspeakable acts. He describes witches flying to nocturnal gatherings where they worshipped the devil, desecrated the Eucharist, and plotted evil deeds against their neighbours. Nieder's vivid accounts of witches' Sabbaths and malefic magic helped to solidify the stereotype of the diabolical witch in the medieval imagination. His work was widely read and cited by later witch hunters, who used it as a kind of field guide for identifying and prosecuting suspected sorcerers. But even as the Formicarius fueled the fires of witch hunting fervour, it also betrayed a deep unease with the very superstitions it sought to combat. Nieder was a learned man, steeped in the scholastic tradition of rational inquiry. He recognized that many accusations of witchcraft were rooted in ignorance, malice, or delusion. In one passage, Nieder relates the story of a woman who was accused of witchcraft after a neighbor dreamed that she had cursed him. Under torture, the woman confessed to a host of fantastical crimes, from flying on a broomstick to giving birth to a litter of monstrous toads. Yet Nieder expresses skepticism about the veracity of these claims, noting that they were extracted under duress and bore all the hallmarks of false confession. This ambivalence reflects the complex attitudes of medieval intellectuals toward witchcraft and superstition. On the one hand, theologians like Nieder saw belief in sorcery as a dangerous delusion, a relic of pagan ignorance that needed to be stamped out. On the other hand, they couldn't entirely dismiss the power of the supernatural, which was woven into the very fabric of Christian doctrine. After all, if God could work miracles and demons could possess the unwary, who was to say that witches couldn't fly through the night or blight crops with their curses? The line between orthodoxy and superstition was often blurry, and even the most learned clergymen could find themselves caught up in the fever dream of the witch hunt. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern era, the witch craze reached its terrible apex. The publication of the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, in 1487 codified the methods of witch hunting and helped to spread the contagion of superstition across Europe. Over the next 2 centuries, thousands of women, and some men, would be tortured, hanged, or burned alive for the crime of witchcraft. The legacy of the witch hunts still haunts us today, a reminder of the terrible costs of unchecked superstition and scapegoating. But as we look back on the disturbing world of medieval folklore, it's important to remember that these dark fantasies sprang from the same human impulses that give rise to our most ennobling myths and our most enduring stories. The medieval mind was a strange and wondrous thing, capable of both brutal cruelty and transcendent beauty. In the flickering shadows of the witch's pyre and the fairy's glade, we catch a glimpse of the hopes and horrors that animated our ancestors' imaginations. And in the tales they told, we see a reflection of our own deepest fears and most ardent desires. As we lay our heads down to sleep, let us dream of a world where the only monsters are the ones we conjure up in stories, and the only magic is the enchantment of a well-told tale. For in the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of medieval folklore is the reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit still yearns for wonder, for mystery, and for the promise of a brighter dawn. So let us close our eyes and drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that the ghosts and goblins of the past are nothing more than shadows on the wall, figments of our own imagining. And let us dream of a future where reason and compassion triumph over fear and superstition, and where the only witchcraft we practice is the magic of kindness and understanding. Good night, dear listener, and pleasant dreams. After centuries of witch-hunting fervour, belief in malevolent witchcraft persisted into the modern era. The disturbing legacy of medieval witch trials echoed through the Salem witch trials of 1692, where mass hysteria gripped the Puritan settlement. 19 innocent women and men were executed, accused of cavorting with the devil and afflicting their neighbours with curses. The names of those hanged, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, and more, stand as a sombre reminder of the power of superstition to breed deadly paranoia. Even as the Age of Enlightenment dawned in the 18th century, bringing new emphasis on reason over dogma, old folklore died hard. Across Europe, the eerie figure of the vampire continued to haunt the popular imagination. In 1732, the case of Arnold Powell, a Serbian soldier believed to have returned from the grave as a blood-sucking revenant, caused a sensation. Powell's exhumed corpse was ritually staked through the heart, a medieval method of dispatching the undead that endured for centuries. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century saw a resurgence of interest in the dark lore of the Middle Ages. Poets and novelists mined the rich vein of medieval folklore for inspiration, crafting iconic tales of terror that shaped the emerging genres of Gothic fiction and horror. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's 1798 poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, drew upon the medieval motif of the wandering Jew, condemned to walk the earth for eternity. The albatross killed by the mariner becomes a symbol of his transgression and guilt, much like tales of medieval sinners forced to do penance as undead revenants. Gothic tales like John Polidori's The Vampire and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla established the seductive vampire as a fixture of 19th century fiction, fusing medieval folklore with contemporary anxieties about the supernatural other lurking in the shadows of gaslit streets. Such stories paved the way for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, which drew upon Transylvanian legends of the Strigoi, or undead, to craft an enduring icon of horror. Through the fictional Count Dracula, a grotesque relic of medieval superstition stepped into the modern world, an incarnation of primal fears given eternal life on the page. Even as Victorian intellectuals attempted to banish the vestiges of irrational medieval beliefs from their increasingly scientific worldview, the old lore persisted. In Britain, the mystic and scholar Margaret Murray popularized the controversial theory that the witches persecuted in the Middle Ages and early modern era were practitioners of a prehistoric pagan religion. Her 1921 book, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, gave rise to neo-paganism and Wicca, new religious movements that both drew upon and subverted the stereotypes of the Wicked Witch inherited from medieval folklore. The early 20th century saw the rise of professional folklorists devoted to preserving the vanishing peasant traditions of Europe. Pioneers like Andrew Lang and the Brothers Grimm collected fairy tales and folk beliefs, while the Irish poet William Butler Yeats championed Celtic folklore as a wellspring of timeless wisdom. In their hands, the often unsettling lore of the medieval countryside was reframed as quaint superstition or whimsical fantasy, its darker edges sanded down for nursery reading. Yet the undercurrents of the uncanny persist in these Bowdlerized tales, inviting us to read between the lines. When the Grimms tell of Frau Trude, a cannibalistic witch who lures a curious girl to her doom, we hear the echo of medieval tales like the quasi-historical account of Melusine, the half-serpent wife of a French count. The archetypes repeat: the monstrous feminine, the transgressive woman, the supernatural intruder in the home. However much we may dismiss these tropes as irrational relics of a benighted age, they continue to unsettle us, tapping into primal fears that never quite fade. In our modern era of skyscrapers and fiber optics, the old lore lurks in the shadow of progress. Psychologists debate the evolutionary origins of belief in ghosts and demons, while scientists study the role of sleep paralysis in generating visions of supernatural assaults by night-riding hags. And in the dark corners of the internet, creepypasta spreads like digital folklore, rehashing medieval motifs for a new millennium. The online urban legend of Slender Man, a faceless spectre who stalks children, would be right at home in a 15th century manuscript, a digital revenant for the age of smartphones and social media. Perhaps the lesson of medieval folklore is that we can never fully banish the darkness from our collective psyche. However much we strive to light our reality with the bulb of reason, the disturbing imagination of our ancestors shadows us. To grapple with the lore they left behind is to confront the unquiet ghosts in our mental attic, rattling their chains and warning us of the unlit country that lies beyond the campfire of the known. Their tales may unsettle our sleep and haunt our dreams, but they also remind us of the eternal fragility of mortal existence. Like the dancing skeletons in medieval frescoes, the strange creatures of folklore lead us in a waltz with death and uncertainty. We may recoil from their rictus grins, but we cannot deny our kinship with the long line of trembling souls who passed them down. Lying awake in the darkened bedchamber, our mind may drift uneasily on the night tides. But in that liminal space between waking and dream, we keep faith with the whispering ancestors whose fearful visions still beguile and bedazzle us from the depths of the past. So let us not dismiss the uncanny lore of the Middle Ages as mere historical curiosity, for in the end, their nightmares are our own, refracted through the warped glass of time. By peering through the cracks into the medieval mind, we may just catch a glimpse of the face that stares back at us from the mirror of history, familiar and strange, a reflection of the eternal human condition, poised forever between dread and wonder at the vast mystery of the world we inhabit for our brief span upon the stage. And with that unsettling thought, we come to the end of our journey through the haunted forest of medieval folklore. The campfire burns low, the shadows lengthen, and the wind whispers secrets in a language we have only begun to fathom. It's time to bank the embers and retire to our uneasy beds, where the old tales may trouble and inspire our dreams. Until the next time when the fancy strikes to venture again into that unquiet country of the past, this is your faithful chronicler, bidding you a good night and pleasant slumbers. May the night-riding hag pass you by unscathed, and the grimacing Strix keep its gory talons from your throat as you surrender to the soothing embrace of sleep. Rest well, fellow traveller, and dream of brighter visions than the ones we've summoned here. The disturbing world of medieval folklore will still be waiting when you wake, as it always has, a cracked mirror held up to the eternal fears and wonders of the human soul. The 15th century theologian Johannes Nieder was a man deeply troubled by what he saw as the growing threat of witchcraft in medieval society. Born in the Swabian village of Isny im Allgäu around 1380, Nieder entered the Dominican order as a young man and quickly rose through the ranks thanks to his keen intellect and religious zeal. As a professor of theology at the University of Vienna, Nida became increasingly preoccupied with the menace of heresy and sorcery. He began collecting accounts of accused witches, sorcerers, and their vile misdeeds, meticulously recording the lurid details in his notebooks. Nida saw it as his sacred duty to expose the evil that he believed was festering throughout Christendom. This obsessive research culminated in his most famous work, Formicarius, or The Anthill. Published around 1437, this hefty 5-volume treatise was a compendium of all the knowledge Nida had gathered about witchcraft, demons, and the dark arts. He chose the title as an allegorical reference to the industrious and orderly society of ants, which he held up as a model for the Christian community. Just as an anthill is a paragon of productivity and cooperation, Nida believed the church should work together to root out the cancer of witchcraft that threatened the social fabric. Formicarius was his rallying cry for other theologians and clerics to take up arms in this righteous struggle. The pages of Formicarius teem with shocking stories of witches' depraved crimes and obscene pacts with Satan. Nida describes in almost pornographic detail the witches' sabbaths, where covens would gather to worship the devil, desecrate the cross, and engage in all manner of sexual abominations. According to Nida, witches could transform into animals, ride through the night sky on brooms or pitchforks, and blight crops with a mere glance. They stole consecrated hosts to use in their blasphemous rituals, and sacrificed unbaptized infants to their infernal master. No perversion or sacrilege was too vile for these disciples of Satan. Nida reserved special contempt for midwives who worked as witches. In his fevered telling, these women would secretly consecrate newborns to the devil and use their bodies to make magical potions. He accuses them of killing babies in the womb so they could feast on the flesh with their fellow hags. While some of Nida's contemporaries dismissed his more outlandish claims, Formicarius struck a chord in certain quarters of the church. The late Middle Ages was a time of social upheaval, religious doubt, and apocalyptic dread. For many, the horrors described by Nida seemed all too plausible, a tangible manifestation of the evil that surely heralded the end times. As a result, Formicarius became something of a manual for witch hunters in the 15th and 16th centuries. Its relentless cataloguing of witches' crimes and methods for extracting confessions helped to codify the image of the diabolical witch in the popular imagination. Inquisitors and judges consulted the book as they tried accused sorcerers, searching for the telltale signs of corruption that Nida had so painstakingly described. While Johannes Nida didn't live to see the full, terrible impact of his work, he died of plague in 1438. His baleful influence lingered long after his passing. Formicarius planted the seeds that would sprout into full-blown witch hysteria in the coming centuries. The notion that witches were a vast, hidden threat, working to undermine the very foundations of Christian society, would be used to justify the torture and execution of untold thousands of people, most of them women. Of course, Nida was a product of his time, a man steeped in the superstitions and anxieties of the late medieval world. For him, witches were a very real and present danger, not simply the fantasies of a fevered mind. And yet, there's a disturbing relish in the way he describes their alleged crimes, a prurient fascination with the gory particulars of their evil. One can't help but wonder if Nida didn't take a certain satisfaction in his self-appointed role as a soldier of Christ, battling the forces of darkness wherever they might lurk. In his mind, perhaps, he was a noble crusader, a defender of the faith bravely confronting the ultimate enemy. But from our modern vantage point, Nida looks more like a tragic, even pathetic figure. A man so consumed by his own paranoia and righteousness that he could no longer distinguish fantasy from reality. In his zeal to cleanse the world of evil, he only succeeded in adding to its sum total of misery and suffering. It's a cautionary tale, in many ways, about the dangers of blind certainty and moral panic. When we allow our fears and prejudices to override our reason and compassion, even the most well-intentioned among us can become agents of cruelty and injustice. Johannes Nieder may have believed he was doing God's work, but in the end, his legacy is one of darkness, not light. He stoked the flames of a deadly superstition that would claim countless innocent lives and leave a lasting stain on European history. And so we remember him not as a righteous warrior or a brilliant scholar, but as a sad, deluded man who gazed too long into the abyss of human wickedness and mistook his own reflection for the face of the devil. In the annals of medieval folklore, Johannes Nieder is a figure of tragedy and terror, a reminder of the all-too-human capacity for cruelty in the name of virtue. But Nider's Formicarius was just one thread in the dark tapestry of late medieval folklore. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, Europeans found themselves confronted with the spectre of death on an unprecedented scale. Plague, famine, and warfare scythed through the population, leaving behind a landscape of suffering and despair. In this grim environment, it's little wonder that macabre themes crept into the art and storytelling of the time. One of the most enduring motifs to emerge from this period was the dance of death, or danse macabre, a chilling allegory of the universality and inevitability of death. The basic premise of the dance of death was simple yet profound. In a series of vignettes, death himself was depicted as a grinning skeleton, leading people from all walks of life in a grim procession to the grave. Kings and paupers, bishops and beggars, young and old, all were forced to join hands and dance to death's pitiless tune. These morbid scenes appeared in frescoes, woodcuts, and illuminated manuscripts across late medieval Europe. One of the most famous examples was the sprawling mural at the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris, painted in the early 15th century. Against a bleak, ashen background, the skeletal figure of death cavorted with a motley crew of doomed mortals, their faces frozen in rictuses of terror and despair. The message of the Dance of Death was clear. No matter one's station or wealth, all must eventually succumb to the great leveler. Death was the ultimate equalizer, mocking the pretensions and vanities of earthly life. In a world where social hierarchies were rigidly enforced and the gap between rich and poor yawned wide, there was a certain grim comfort in this idea. But the Dance of Death was more than just a memento mori, a reminder of life's fleeting nature. It was also a biting satire of a society that seemed increasingly corrupt and unjust. In many depictions, the skeletal death figure took on a gleefully subversive role, poking fun at the pomposity of the powerful and exposing the hypocrisy of the pious. One can imagine the dark laughter that must have echoed through the taverns and marketplaces of medieval Europe as the common folk whispered about the latest dance of death making the rounds. For a brief moment, the oppressed and downtrodden could revel in the idea that even the mightiest would one day be brought low, their worldly glories turned to dust and ashes. Of course, the Dance of Death was also a reflection of the very real horrors that stalked the medieval world. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century and periodically thereafter, had a particularly profound impact on the collective psyche. In a matter of just a few years, up to half the population of Europe was wiped out by the pestilence. Eyewitness accounts of the time paint a nightmarish picture of streets littered with corpses, whole families wiped out in a matter of days, and the awful stench of death hanging heavy in the air. In the face of such unimaginable devastation, it's little wonder that people became obsessed with the macabre and the morbid. The plague also had a more insidious effect on the social fabric. As the bodies piled up and panic set in, the bonds of community and civility began to fray. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Jews and other marginalized groups were scapegoated and brutalized. and a general sense of nihilism and despair took hold. In this atmosphere of fear and mistrust, the dance of death took on a darker, more menacing edge. No longer just a wry commentary on the foibles of the human condition, it became a grim prophecy of the end times, a harbinger of the apocalypse that seemed to loom ever closer. And yet, even in the midst of all this horror, there was something strangely cathartic about the dance of death. By confronting the spectre of mortality head-on, by laughing in the face of the abyss, medieval Europeans found a way to cope with the unimaginable trauma of their age. In a sense, the dance of death was a kind of twisted therapy, a way of processing the unprocessable and finding some small measure of solace in the shared destiny of all living things. It was a reminder that no matter how bleak and hopeless things might seem, we are all ultimately united in death. As the medieval era drew to a close and Europe gradually emerged from the shadow of the plague, the obsession with death and the macabre began to fade. But the legacy of the dance of death endured, its haunting imagery and sardonic spirit echoing down through the centuries. You can see its influence in the ghoulish woodcuts of Albrecht Dürer, the twisted fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, and the Gothic novels of the 19th century. Even today, in our own anxious and uncertain times, the dance of death continues to resonate, a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the folly of human pretension. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through the dark heart of medieval folklore, it's worth remembering the lesson of the dance of death. For all our achievements and aspirations, for all our dreams of immortality and glory, we are all ultimately bound by the same fate. In the face of that stark reality, perhaps the best we can do is to embrace the absurdity and the gallows humor of it all, to dance with death even as it leads us into the unknown, to find some small comfort in the knowledge that, in the end, we are all in this mad, mad dance together. And with that thought, we draw the curtains on this dark and unsettling chapter of human history, the medieval world with all its wonders and horrors, its angels and demons, recedes into the mists of time. But the stories it left behind, the tales of witches and werewolves, of ghostly lovers and grinning skulls, will endure as long as humans gather to share the strange, sad miracle of our existence. So sleep now, dear listener, and dream of a time when the veil between the worlds was thin, and the fantastic and the frightful walked hand in hand beneath a cold and uncaring moon. For in the end, perhaps that is all history really is. A long, strange dream from which we never truly wake. After the horrors of the Black Death subsided, people across Europe were left grappling with unfathomable loss and a shaken worldview. In this climate of existential dread, macabre imagery and morbid tales proliferated. One of the most haunting artistic genres to emerge was the danse macabre, or dance of death. Picture this ghastly scene. A skeleton, the grim personification of death itself, leads a procession of figures from all walks of life in a final, fatal dance. Kings and commoners, bishops and beggars, young and old. Death spares none. With a leering grin, the skeletal reveller clutches the hands of its victims, forcing them to join its ghoulish conga line to the grave. These unsettling images began appearing on church walls, in frescoes and paintings, across France, Germany, England, and beyond in the 15th century. One of the earliest and most famous examples was the now lost mural at Holy Innocent Cemetery in Paris, painted in 1424. It spawned countless imitations. The dance of death tapped into the era's morbid zeitgeist. It served as a grim reminder of life's fickleness and death's inevitability in a society still reeling from the traumas of plague. The Black Death had erased traditional distinctions, striking down both the mighty and the meek with little rhyme or reason. The dance macabre reflected this levelling effect, portraying death as the great equalizer. One 15th century French chronicler wrote of the spreading dance craze. Vain and transitory things have been depicted, in cemeteries especially, as a blanket reminder to all that, though today we may be rich, noble or powerful, soon we will all be nothing but dust and ashes, and that very soon. In the dance, each living person is paired with a skeletal doppelganger mocking their earthly station. The Empress's crown is juxtaposed with her withered corpse. The gallant knight is tugged toward oblivion by his own rotting double. It's a dance grotesque, where the only partner is a grinning cadaver. The motif spread rapidly in both religious and secular contexts. In churches, it delivered a stern memento mori, a reminder of death meant to spur the faithful toward penitence and away from worldly vanity. But it soon leapt from cathedral walls to castle halls, appearing in court murals, illuminated manuscripts, even decorative clocks. One particularly elaborate depiction graced the walls of the Parisian Cimetière des Innocents, surrounding late medieval Parisians with an inescapable vision of their own impending doom every time they passed the crowded graveyard. A series of 30 life-sized figures was shown processing toward the charnel house, where bones of the dead were piled high. Each living archetype, from the pontiff to the pauper, met their macabre match in death. The dance of death was more than just a morbid artistic fad. It was a cultural mirror reflecting deep societal anxieties. Death was a constant spectre looming over medieval life. If the Black Death had made human mortality terrifyingly real, the dance macabre turned that grim reality into a symbolic tableau. Scholars have noted how the motif inverted traditional hierarchies. In feudal society, the social classes were rigidly separated in life, but in the skeletal procession, all were equal and all linked by the bony grip of a shared destiny. The mighty found themselves helpless, just another link in death's chain. So while ostensibly macabre, the dance conveyed a certain dark comfort. Rich and poor, sinner and saint all shared the same fate. The living might cling to worldly vanities, but the dance macabre reminded them that life is a fleeting dance, and none may refuse when death itself comes calling for a partner. As one 15th century French poet wrote, meditating on the skeletal dancers, though life does bring joy, none can postpone his dance when at last the piper plays his solemn note. See them join the caper 'neath the cypress trees. Hop they must to death's tune, each soul with mortal ease. The fascination with the dance of death waned in the 16th century as medieval gloom gave way to Renaissance light, but it experienced a revival in later eras, especially the plague-ravaged 17th century and the death-haunted Romantic period. Even today, its unsettling imagery persists in our visual culture, from Halloween decorations to heavy metal album covers. The dance macabre endures as a relic of a society forced to stare its own mortality in the face. Through art, music, and poetry, medieval Europeans grappled with the Great Leveller, the one force that made paupers of kings and emperors. In the dance of death, we see the perennial human struggle to come to terms with the big sleep that awaits us all. For all its ghoulishness, there's something strangely soothing about the dance macabre. In portraying the fundamental equality and shared humanity of all people, it offered an odd comfort to those living in the shadow of death. Rich or poor, pious or profane, all mortals are linked by the grim grip of that final waltz into the eternal twilight. And so, having traced the morbid twirls and macabre steps of the medieval dance of death, we return to our overarching theme, the tenacious hold of folklore over the medieval European mind. From fairies to witches, werewolves to revenants, monstrous births to ominous omens, the mental world of medieval people was peopled by a panoply of wonders and horrors. These fantastical tales and terrifying entities served as a symbolic language for grappling with the anxieties and uncertainties of life in a perilous age. In a world of famine, disease, and religious upheaval, folklore mapped out a way of understanding and interpreting events that defied easy explanation. Whether it was Walter Map spinning satirical yarns of demonic encounters, or Gervais of Tilbury cataloguing a litany of marvels and monsters, chroniclers of medieval lore served as guides to the dark corners of the human psyche. Their accounts, however fanciful, reveal the deep currents of fear and fascination that animated the medieval imagination. Even as the old feudal order crumbled and dogmas calcified, folklore remained a vital protean force, shifting its shape to suit the needs and dreads of the age. From peasant superstitions to courtly romances, tales of the uncanny and unnatural provided a way to confront the shadows that lurked at the edges of the candlelight. And what of our own age? For all our technological sophistication and scientific certitude, we remain as entranced by a good scary story as our medieval forebears. From urban legends whispered around digital campfires to the ever-popular paranormal thrillers lining bookstore shelves, we still relish a shivery tale in the dark. Perhaps it's because, like the medieval peasant huddled by the hearth, listening to tales of imp and demon, we sense that the world is vaster and stranger than our philosophies can pass. The universe's dark matter still eludes us. The human heart remains a shadowed wood. In grappling with forces beyond our ken, we find ourselves not so far from the fireside storytellers of old. So as we close the creaking covers on this compendium of medieval myth and legend, let us ponder the perennial allure of folklore. These tales that once sent a shudder down the spines of serfs and kings still exert an uncanny pull on our modern minds. They remind us that, for all our advanced learning, we still dwell in a world of wonders and horrors. A place where, in the immortal words of Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. May the monstrous, the marvelous, and the macabre forever lurk at the edges of our collective dreams, inviting us to ponder the shadows beyond the firelight. For in the end, perhaps the real magic of folklore is its power to enchant and unsettle us in any age, to make us feel, if only for a shivery moment, that we are all medieval listeners gathered round the flickering flames, straining to hear the devilish whispers carried on the wind. And with that, dear listener, we bid you pleasant dreams. May your sleep be deep and untroubled by the prancing skeletons and hungry revenants of the haunted medieval night. Rest easy in the knowledge that, as one medieval wag put it, be we king or peasant, soon or late, we all join death's dance. Until next time, fare thee well, and don't let the vampires bite. As we delve deeper into the unsettling realm of the medieval folklore, we encounter some of the era's most feared and fantastical creatures, the werewolves and wild men believed to stalk the shadowy forests of Europe. To the medieval mind, few monsters evoked as much dread as the werewolf, a cursed being doomed to transform into a ravenous wolf or wolf-like creature. Numerous tales circulated of humans, often through some diabolical pact or curse, shape-shifting into vicious lupine beasts that terrorized villages and devoured livestock. One notorious account, recorded by the 12th century English writer William of Malmesbury, tells of a priest encountering a pair of werewolves while travelling through a remote wood. The creatures, a man and woman, confessed they were forced to assume wolf form for a period of years as penance for their sins. Such stories reflect the deep-rooted fear of hidden evil lurking within outwardly normal individuals. The werewolf represented the ever-present threat of humans yielding to their basest, most animalistic impulses and turning on their own kind. This theme of internal corruption, made manifest, emerges again and again in medieval lore. But werewolves weren't the only unnatural denizens thought to haunt the wilderness beyond the safety of human settlements. Many medieval folk believed that the dense, primordial forests harbored tribes of wild men. Hirsute, uncivilized beings occupying a liminal space between beast and man. Covered in shaggy hair and dwelling in caves, these elusive creatures were sometimes regarded as placid, simple-minded inhabitants of nature, almost akin to the noble savage archetype. Other times, however, wild men took on a more menacing character. Some tales painted them as aggressive, barely human brutes, prone to kidnapping and devouring wayward travelers. They were often linked with pagan giants, demonic satyrs, or the depraved races spawned by Cain after his exile from the sight of God. In a sense, wild men and werewolves embodied two sides of the same coin. External representations of the untamed, uncivilized energies believed to live inside the human soul. While werewolves revealed the beast hidden within man, wild men showed what became of those who surrendered completely to their primal nature. Both creatures highlighted the importance medieval society placed on controlling one's dark urges, taming the inner wilderness through devotion and strict adherence to cultural mores. Underpinning these beliefs was the concept that man, as a hybrid of flesh and spirit, straddled the earthly and heavenly realms. To succumb entirely to base instincts was to damn oneself, to become something subhuman in the eyes of God. And what greater reminder of the need for constant spiritual vigilance than a rampaging werewolf or brutish wild man? As frightening as these bestial entities were, however, medieval folklore contained threats of an even more insidious nature. For beneath the veneer of human civilization, even within the very walls of home and hearth, witches and their dark magic were thought to be ever at work, sowing curses and corruption. A climate of growing paranoia began to take hold as common misfortunes, failed crops, ailing livestock, inexplicable illness, were increasingly blamed on the secret machinations of witches. But who were these alleged disciples of the devil, and what malevolent powers did they wield? The answers reveal the depths of medieval anxieties about evil in its most human guise. As the medieval world grappled with the spectre of witchcraft, one man's writings would prove deeply influential in shaping attitudes and stoking the fires of witch hunts to come. Johannes Nider was a 15th century German theologian and Dominican friar who penned an incendiary treatise on witches titled Formicarius, or The Ant Hill. Born in the Swabian town of Isny im Allgäu around 1380, Nider embarked on a clerical path from a young age. He entered the Dominican order as a youth and studied theology at Vienna and Cologne, two great centers of learning in the Holy Roman Empire. Nider quickly distinguished himself through his erudition and oratorical skills. He served as prior at several Dominican monasteries and was a prominent participant at the Council of Basel in the 1430s, where church leaders sought to address the festering crises plaguing Christendom. It was against this tumultuous backdrop that Nider began work on Formicarius around 1435. The treatise takes the form of a dialogue between a theologian and a curious student, covering a wide range of topics related to sin, heresy, and diabolical influence in the world. But it is the fifth and final book of Formicarius, dealing exclusively with witches and their malevolent arts, for which the work is best remembered. In lurid detail, Nider describes the various misdeeds and perversions of witches. They fly through the night sky to engage in depraved gatherings, copulate with demons, and gleefully destroy the fruits of the earth. Nider relates how witches steal male genitalia, either physically or through illusion, and even devour children. Such sensational accounts were calculated to shock and unsettle the pious reader. Central to Nider's conception of witchcraft is the belief that these evildoers entered into a deliberate pact with Satan himself. In exchange for their devoted service and veneration, the devil granted witches the power to work their vile magic. This notion of the demonic pact would become a defining feature of the archetypal witch in the European imagination. Nider drew from earlier sources and anecdotes in compiling his dark portrait of witches, He cites the experiences of an inquisitor named Benedict, who had interrogated accused witches in the Savoy region of France. Under torture, these wretched souls confessed to all manner of obscene crimes and implicated others in their diabolical conspiracy. Such accounts lent a chilling air of authenticity to Nida's narrative. Though by no means the first to write about witchcraft, Nida's Formicarius crystallized many of the tropes and stereotypes that would fuel the witch hunts of the early modern era. His emphasis on the witch as a servant of Satan, endowed with infernal powers to harm the righteous, created a truly terrifying figure. If the devil's minions walked among us, ever ready to corrupt the faithful, then no measure was too extreme in rooting them out. Formicarius circulated widely in manuscript form and was printed in 1475, a decade after Nida's death. Along with later works like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, it helped establish Dominican friars as zealous crusaders against the plague of witchcraft they saw festering across Europe. Nida's bleak vision of a world besieged by satanic forces resonated with authorities both secular and religious. Of course, the many innocents who fell victim to the witch hunts, spurred by such fevered rhetoric, can hardly be overlooked. Women, especially those on the margins of society, bore the brunt of the persecutions that swept Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The same morbid fascination with witches that made Formicarius a medieval bestseller would lead to untold suffering in the years to come. For all his erudition and moralizing tone, Nida comes across as a chronicler gripped by dark fantasies of vice and malevolence. His witches are larger-than-life villains, capable of the most grotesque deeds imaginable. In that sense, perhaps Formicarius tells us more about the anxieties and preoccupations of the late medieval clerical mind than it does about any real-life heretics. Nevertheless, Johannes Nida's Formicarius stands as a landmark text in the history of European witchcraft. Its potent blend of theological argumentation and sensationalist anecdote helped define the witch as the ultimate enemy of God and man. Though the witch hunts have long since faded into history, their echoes still linger in our collective imagination, a reminder of the destructive power of irrational fear and inflamed rhetoric. As the medieval world descended ever deeper into superstition and paranoia about witchcraft, the lines between folklore and reality began to blur. Tales once whispered around the hearth took on a terrible urgency as neighbor turned against neighbor in the frenzied hunt for Satan's disciples. And through it all, the restless dead continued to stalk the margins of the living, a reminder of the fragility of life in an age haunted by death. Belief in ghosts and revenants, corpses that rose from the grave to torment the living, was widespread in medieval Europe. Tales of spectral visitations and hauntings abound in the literature of the time, reflecting a deep-seated anxiety about the barrier between the worlds of the living and the dead. One particularly unsettling type of revenant was the Draugr of Scandinavian lore. These undead creatures were believed to haunt their burial mounds, guarding the treasures buried with them in life. But the Draugr were no mere passive spirits. They were known to viciously attack any who dared to disturb their rest. In the Icelandic saga of Grettir the Strong, the hero must confront a Draugr named Glam, who has been terrorizing a farm. Glam was a brutish shepherd in life, and in death he returns as a hulking, malevolent revenant. Grettir wrestles with the creature in a titanic struggle, barely managing to behead the corpse and lay it to rest. Such tales of the marauding undead reflect the very real fears of medieval Scandinavians, who lived in a harsh and unforgiving landscape where death was ever present. The Draugr embodied the dangers of the untamed wilderness, the threat of the unknown that lurked just beyond the firelight. Elsewhere in Europe, the revenant took on a decidedly more corporeal form. In the 12th century, William of Newburgh recorded a chilling account of a revenant that stalked the English town of Berwick. The cadaver rose from its grave and wandered the streets at night, spreading pestilence and terror wherever it roamed. The townsfolk, at their wits' end, finally resorted to digging up the body and burning it to ashes. Only then did the nightly visitations cease. This grim practice of exhuming and mutilating suspected revenants became a recurring motif in medieval ghost stories, a testament to the very real fear that the dead might return to prey on the living. But not all ghostly encounters were so gruesome. Some tales spoke of spirits returning to settle unfinished business or to seek justice for wrongs committed against them in life. The 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus relates the story of a murdered man who appears to his friend in a dream, revealing the location of his hidden bones and demanding a proper burial. Only when the friend fulfills this request does the ghost finally rest in peace. Such stories underscore the importance medieval Christians placed on proper funeral rites and the consecration of remains. To die unshriven, or to have one's corpse mistreated, was to risk a restless afterlife. The Church taught that the souls of the deceased faced a reckoning in the hereafter, and that the prayers of the living could ease their passage through purgatory. This belief found its most poignant expression in the medieval legend of the Grateful Dead, in which a living person shows kindness to an unburied corpse, usually by paying its debts or arranging its funeral, and is later rewarded by the revenant's intercession in a time of crisis. In one popular tale, a knight sacrifices his last coin to bury a dishonored corpse, only to be saved from a demon's clutches by the grateful spirit. For all their macabre trappings, these stories of the Grateful Dead affirm the enduring bond between the living and those who have passed on. They suggest that acts of compassion and remembrance can reach beyond the grave, forging a connection that even death cannot sever. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, Europeans found themselves grappling with the calamitous effects of famine, war, and pestilence. The Black Death of the 14th century had decimated the population, leaving a profound psychological scar on the survivors. In this climate of morbid anxiety, a new artistic motif emerged that would come to define the late medieval mindset: the danse macabre, or dance of death. The dance of death was an allegorical genre that depicted all members of society, from kings to paupers, being led to the grave by skeletal personifications of death. These grim processions were often painted on the walls of churches or illustrated in books of hours, serving as a stark reminder of life's brevity and the inevitability of mortality. One of the earliest and most famous examples of the dance of death is found in the Parisian cemetery of Les Saints Innocents. Painted between 1424 and 1425, the mural stretched over the cemetery walls, depicting a hierarchy of figures from pope to peasant dancing with their skeletal doubles. Each living person is paired with a grinning corpse, a macabre doppelganger ushering them toward the tomb. The accompanying verses, written in Middle French, drive home the message with bleak humour. You who pass by, consider well how little you will be remembered after death, and conduct yourself in such a way that you have no dread of death. The dance of death at Les Saints Innocents quickly became a sensation, spawning countless imitations across Europe. From the frescoes of Lübeck's Marienkirche to the woodcuts of Hans Holbein the Younger, the motif spread like a memento mori plague, infiltrating the visual culture of the late Middle Ages. But the dance of death was more than just a morbid fascination with mortality. It was a subversive commentary on the social hierarchies of medieval society, a leveling force that reduced all to mere bones. In the face of death, the dance proclaims, all earthly distinctions are rendered meaningless. This egalitarian message held particular resonance in the wake of the Black Death, which had decimated rich and poor alike. The plague had shattered the illusion of stability and order, revealing the fragility of human institutions. In the grinning skeletons of the dance of death, the survivors saw a reflection of their own vulnerability. a reminder that life was fleeting and death the great equalizer. The dance of death also spoke to a growing disillusionment with the church and its promises of salvation. As successive waves of plague and war ravaged Europe, many began to question the efficacy of religious rituals and the integrity of the clergy. The skeletal figures leading popes and bishops to the grave served as a biting critique of ecclesiastical corruption, a suggestion that even the most exalted were not immune to judgment. In the end, the dance of death offered a grim sort of comfort to a society grappling with the spectre of a mass mortality. It acknowledged the universality of death while also hinting at the vanity of earthly striving. If all were bound for the grave, then perhaps the only true meaning lay in living each moment to the fullest, in savouring the precious gift of life while it lasted. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the dance of death gradually faded from the cultural landscape, but its legacy endures in the memento mori of Baroque art, the Gothic literature of the Romantic era, and the horror films of our own time. Whenever we confront the spectre of mortality, we are participating in a tradition that stretches back to those macabre dances of the Middle Ages. The unsettling tales and morbid preoccupations of medieval folklore may seem a far cry from our own rational scientific age. But beneath their fantastical trappings, these stories speak to something deep and enduring in the human psyche. A fascination with the unknown, a fear of the dark, and a yearning to make sense of life's mysteries. In the monsters and witches, the ghosts and the walking dead, we see reflected our own anxieties and desires, our own struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems capricious and cruel. Medieval folklore may have been born of superstition and ignorance, but it also testifies to the power of the human imagination, to our capacity for wonder and terror in the face of the unknown. So perhaps, as we lay our heads down to sleep, we might spare a thought for those long-ago storytellers, huddled around the flickering hearth, spinning tales of the uncanny and the macabre. In their words, we might just catch a glimpse of our own deepest fears and darkest dreams, a reminder that for all our sophistication, we are still the children of the night, forever haunted by the shadows at the edge of the firelight. As we've seen, the obsession with witchcraft and malevolent magic grew increasingly intense in the late Middle Ages. Witch trials became disturbingly common as authorities sought to root out anyone suspected of practicing the dark arts. The methods used to determine guilt were often brutal and irrational. One particularly infamous test was the ordeal by water. The accused witch would be stripped naked, bound and thrown into a body of water. If she sank, she was considered innocent, but if she floated, it was taken as a sign of her guilt. The twisted logic was that pure water would reject the tainted body of a witch. Of course, if the suspect drowned during this sadistic test, that was simply viewed as an unfortunate necessity. Other supposed signs of witchcraft included suspicious birthmarks, warts, or moles that were thought to be the marks of the devil. Examiners would prick these blemishes with needles, and if the accused didn't bleed or feel pain, it was another strike against them. Confessions were frequently extracted under torture, leading to forced admissions of flying on broomsticks, transforming into animals, or cavorting with demons. But even as fear of witches reached a fever pitch, there was still a thriving trade in magic of a more benevolent kind. Folk healers and wise women concocted herbal remedies and recited charms to cure ailments. Superstitious peasants carried talismans to ward off evil and hung protective herbs over their doorways. Love potions and good luck tokens were always in high demand. It all paints a picture of a world caught between faith and fear, where magic could heal or harm depending on the intent behind it. The lines between white magic and black magic were often blurred. An herbalist who cured a nobleman's illness might be praised as a skilled healer. while a beggar woman who muttered curses might be condemned as a wicked enchantress. One man who played a key role in codifying and spreading ideas about witchcraft was Johannes Nieder, a 15th century German theologian. Nieder was a leading member of the Dominican order and a respected religious authority. But he's best remembered today for his lurid treatise on witches, a work called Formicarius, or The Anthill, written around 1437. In this influential text, Nieder relayed sensational accounts of witches' evil deeds that he claimed to have heard from witch hunters and confessed witches themselves under interrogation. His salacious stories described covens of witches who renounced God, trampled on the cross, and swore allegiance to Satan. According to Nieder, they flew to Sabbath meetings on the backs of demons, desecrated the Eucharist, and engaged in depraved orgies with the devil. Nieder's prurient accounts of these blasphemous rites and malevolent acts helped to crystallize the stereotypical image of the diabolical witch in the public imagination. Although belief in witchcraft had existed for centuries, Nieder compiled many of the accusations and tropes into a cohesive narrative. Formicarius painted a terrifying picture of a secret society of witches plotting against Christians with their devilish master. This hugely influential work was widely disseminated, stoking the fires of witch hysteria. Nieder's credulous repetition of outlandish confessions obtained under torture helped to validate and perpetuate the cruel practice of witch hunting. His grim depictions of witches as Satan's servants engaging in obscene acts fueled the moral panic about these alleged evildoers lurking in the midst of good Christian society. The legacy of Formicarius was to lend theological weight and learned authority to the persecution of suspected witches. Its impact endured long after Nieder's death in 1438. As the notion of a vast hidden witch cult took hold, the Inquisition and secular courts prosecuted alleged witches with renewed fervor in the following centuries. The witch trials that swept through early modern Europe, culminating in the notorious Salem Panic of 1692, had their roots in the fantastical accounts promoted by works like Nieder's. But witches weren't the only supernatural entities that stirred up paranoia in the medieval mind. The restless spirits of the dead were thought to roam the earth as well, haunting the living with their baleful presence. Tales of ghosts and revenants abounded, striking fear into the hearts of rich and poor alike. In the medieval Christian worldview, the dead were meant to remain in their graves until the day of judgment, when the righteous would be resurrected to enjoy eternal bliss, and the wicked would be condemned to the fiery pit. Any lingering spirit was thus suspect, a possible agent of the devil, or a lost soul denied entry to heaven. Apparitions were more often regarded as omens of doom than as friendly phantoms. Particularly horrifying were the stories of revenants, corpses that rose from the grave to terrorize the living. In these macabre tales, the cadavers of wicked men and women were reanimated through demonic power, hungering for human flesh and blood. Like a medieval prototype of the modern zombie, these gruesome undead would stalk the night, breaking into houses and attacking the sleeping occupants. One especially ghastly account comes from William of Newburgh, a 12th century English chronicler. In his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, William relates an incident that allegedly occurred in the town of Berwick. A vile man who had been buried there rose from his tomb and began roaming the streets after dark, calling out the names of his neighbours. Those who answered his summons promptly fell sick and died within 3 days. This went on for several nights, until some brave townsfolk dug up the revenant's grave, finding his bloated corpse inside with fresh blood smeared on its shroud. They hauled the body out with hooks, hacked it to bits, and burned the grisly remains to ashes, finally laying the menace to rest. Such ghoulish rituals of dismemberment were thought to be the only sure way to keep a persistent revenant in its tomb. William's lurid tale highlights the morbid preoccupation with death and decay in the medieval psyche. At a time when disease was rampant, famine common, and violence a fact of life, death was an ever-present spectre. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 years, and even those who survived to old age rarely made it past 60. Cemeteries filled up quickly, and mass graves became necessary in times of plague or war. Surrounded by so much mortality, it's little wonder that the medieval mind conjured up nightmarish visions of the unquiet dead. Ghosts and revenants embodied the disturbing notion that death was not always the end, that some remnant of the deceased might linger on in a horrible half-life. These unsettling entities blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural, the living and the deceased. The grim fixation on death found its ultimate expression in a common artistic and literary motif of the late Middle Ages, the dance of death. Also known as the danse macabre, these eerie images depicted the figure of death as a grinning skeleton, leading people from all walks of life in a grotesque conga line to the grave. Kings and commoners, bishops and beggars all linked hands as death played a macabre tune. The point of this morbid allegory was to remind viewers of death's inevitability and the ultimate equality it imposed on all. No matter how wealthy or powerful you were in life, death would come for you in the end, stripping away all earthly distinctions. The dance of death served as a stern memento mori, a warning not to become too attached to the fleeting pleasures of the world. These unsettling scenes adorned the walls of churches and cemeteries, their skeletal figures capering across frescoes and carved into stone. Woodcuts and illuminated manuscripts brought the deathly dance into homes, a constant reminder of life's fragility. At a time when death was so omnipresent, art like this helped people to confront and process their profound anxieties about mortality. One can only imagine the impact these macabre masterpieces had on the medieval mind. To walk into a candlelit church and see the fleshless figure of death leading a daisy chain of doomed souls must have been a chilling experience. It was a stark reminder that no matter how much you tried to avoid it, the Grim Reaper's bony hand would eventually grasp yours, drawing you into the fatal dance. And yet, even in the face of all this mortal dread, medieval people found ways to use humor as a coping mechanism. Manuscript marginalia often featured absurd little doodles of animals playing instruments or performing acrobatics, injecting a note of levity into an otherwise somber work. Death itself could be mocked as well as feared, with satirical epitaphs and parodic last wills pointing out the futility of worldly striving. This strange mixture of the sacred and the profane, the terrifying and the humorous, is part of what makes the world of medieval folklore so enduringly fascinating. In these tales of monsters and marvels, witches and walking corpses, we can see the human mind grappling with the great mysteries of life and death, good and evil. The medieval imagination confronted the darkest aspects of existence and transmuted them into captivating stories and indelible images. Though the dragons and fairies of medieval lore may have long since faded into myth, they still hold a powerful grip on our collective unconscious. These archetypal fears and fantasies continue to shape our literature, our art, even our dreams. When we read the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, or watch a horror film about a vengeful ghost, we are tapping into the rich vein of folklore first mined in the Middle Ages. And in moments of uncertainty or danger, we may find ourselves reaching instinctively for the talismans and rituals of an earlier age. How many modern buildings still have gargoyles perched on their parapets, warding off evil spirits? How many of us still knock on wood or cross our fingers for luck without fully knowing why? Even in our technologically advanced age, we are not so far removed from our superstitious medieval ancestors as we might like to think. In the end, perhaps the true power of medieval folklore lies in its ability to enchant and unsettle us in equal measure. These strange and sometimes disturbing tales serve as a reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edges of human existence, even as they celebrate the enduring power of the imagination. They transport us back to a world that is at once deeply alien and strangely familiar, a world that still has much to teach us about the fears, desires, and wonders of the human heart. And on that haunting note, we come to the end of our journey through the dark delights of medieval folklore. I hope you've enjoyed this bedtime foray into the distant past, and that your dreams will be filled with fantastic visions rather than nightmarish spectres. If you found this historical storytelling soothing, consider giving this video a gentle thumbs up and drifting over to the subscribe button for more cozy content. Wishing you a peaceful slumber in a world thankfully free of malevolent sprites and ravening revenants. Until next time, sleep well.